My name is Christina Guimera, representing ISO Stakeholder Affairs, and I will be facilitating today's meeting. I'm joined in the room by Partha Malvidkar and Matt Fulton. Just a few friendly reminders before we get started today. Today's call is being recorded for informational and convenience purposes only. Any related transcription should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. This meeting is intended to stimulate open dialogue and engage different perspectives, so please keep your comments professional and respectful today. And also, please try to keep your comments and questions succinct so that we're able to hear from everyone today. You can access closed captioning on the bottom left of your screen and the Inteller Transparency Viewer on the bottom right of your screen. Just be sure to refresh before viewing the Transparency Viewer. And we welcome and look forward to your participation today. For raising your hand during the meeting, the raise hand icon is directly at the bottom of your WebEx screen. If you joined audio only, please press *3 on your device. Please remember to state your name and affiliation first before making a comment. And please be sure to pause a few seconds after you unmute to avoid any WebEx delays. You can also send in your comments and questions via chat to all panelists. And if you need any technical assistance during the meeting, please send a chat to the event producer and Teller Events. Today's objectives include reviewing the July 17th RAMPD Track 2 revised straw proposal. And secondly, to hear feedback and answer questions from stakeholders. Today, Partha will be getting us started with an introduction. Then Matt Fulton will be reviewing the revised RAME and resource type application, following a tier assessment, and then a discussion on charges, payments, and bounded penalty exposure. Then we will take a 10-minute break before Matt discusses bidding requirements and outage substitution and definitions. Then we will have a presentation from Carrie Bentley at WPTF. Afterwards, we will wrap up for the day with next steps. So with that, I will go ahead and turn things over to Partha Malvidkar to get us started.
Thank you, Christina. And yeah, thank you everybody who's joined both on the phone and in person. Maybe I'll first make a plug for anyone who's in the greater Sacramento area. Our facilities has kindly provided breakfast for folks. So if you were able to make the short drive out, I'd certainly welcome it. We have a good number of attendees in person as well. I really appreciate everybody's making the effort to join here in person. So just to kick us off, I really appreciate everyone's engagement and feedback on our first Track 2 straw proposal. I know we published our revised straw proposal in response to the feedback of participants last week, including making a couple of key changes to the design, which Matt will go over. But also, we're meeting here today. Largely, that proposal discusses clarifications to the design based on the stakeholder feedback. So part of the discussion here today is really like we're hoping to sort of hone in on, do we provide the clarifications necessary? Are there additional clarifications that are needed into what the design would be looking to accomplish and the methodologies of how it's accomplishing it? So really look forward to a constructive discussion today. I'm joined here by Matt Fulton. If you haven't met Matt, if you're in person, please do. Matt's been at the ISO for 7 weeks, so 8, 9, okay. 8 weeks is plenty of time in that case. I think someone noted that it was nice that we gave him a nice non-controversial topic to lead. Yeah, so I'm going to turn over to Matt, who's going to be walking through some of our changes to the design. Please, we'll pause for questions intermittently, but if you have anything in the room, please raise your placard. There's obviously a raise hand feature for everybody online, but yeah, really appreciate the engagement, and yeah, look forward to a good discussion today.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Nice to meet you all. Thank you, Partha, for the introduction. So yeah, RAMPD Track 2. As people know, back in May, we advanced a package of operational RA reforms, and we focused on availability, market visibility, and outage substitution. The current July straw proposal that we just published last Friday, we focused on resource type application rules. So we kind of talked about this a little bit in the May proposal, and we went into more detail in the application type section in the most recent revised trial proposal. We refined the two-tier assessment period structure and how those triggers work and added more clarity there. We provided examples and clarifications to the allocation structure between load and generation, as well as our proposal for the must offer obligation for system RA resources, and a few clarifications there on some specific resources, and clarifications on the outage substitution shopping cart. The outage definitions are largely unchanged, but we'll get into that later this morning. And so just this is something from the previous iteration, and we have a few key changes here. So the first one being the tier structure. So we focused the tier 2 on the upward capacity and sufficiency failure within the EDAM RSC. Tier 1 is still focused on elevated reliability risk conditions. However, as we'll see later, we clarified what we're looking at for the methodology for that, and some other pieces to the tier 1 structure that we're looking for stakeholder feedback on. The tiered pricing, we still are keeping it at the day ahead LMP and proposing the $2,000 per megawatt hour. The per event frequency assess energy offers in the day ahead hourly or real-time interval individually. And for exemptions, I hope people had time to absorb the paper. Thermal, storage, VERS, hydro, DR. We assess using technology-specific availability, and we're retaining the current exemption for participating load and metered subsystems. And we propose to eliminate the under 1 megawatt small resource exemption. And so just a little overview of stakeholder feedback from the May 15th call. So highlighting here is load side, CPUC, DMM. So what we saw from load side LSCs, IOUs, penalties and settlement impacts need to be predictable and explainable. We need a clear tier 1 and tier 2 triggers. I think that was also broadly across the board from stakeholders, some feedback there. We need settlement examples showing who pays and who receives revenue. This is something that we addressed in the paper. CPUC and LRA authority. The MOO may overlap with LRA and CPUC authority or RA counting and shown values. The energy division raises concerns that CAISO calculated MOO could conflict with LRA determinations. And the proposal should clarify the ISO's operational role versus LRA authority. DMM mostly focused. DMM had a lot to say, but they focus a lot also on tier 1 and making sure that it's a meaningful trigger and it triggers often enough to matter. And also exemptions should be narrowed. And as far as generators and some specific like storage, VERS, hybrids, public power, hydro, DR participating load, penalty exposure may exceed what was sold, shown, or compensated. This seems across the board from generators. RAM exposure should be tied to shown RA, which, as you'll see, we addressed that in the paper as well. Tier 2 should reflect causation, not just any EDAM RSC failure, and existing contracts may not have priced in new penalty exposure. On the VERS side, standard generator style rules may mismeasure availability, and just some specifics into storage, VERS, hybrids, some comments there, which we addressed in our resource specific section of the paper, and public power, hydro, DR, participating load. So these all have pretty unique contract structures and limitations, which we address a bit in the paper as well.
I thought too, I noticed that Kathleen has her hand raised. This might be a good time just to pause and to see, we recognize the fact that there was, we're trying to provide a summary of stakeholder feedback, and there was, a lot of feedback. And so but this might be a good time to sort of, if anyone wants to, maybe we can call on Kathleen, but if anyone else wants to sort of chime in with either questions or refinements, love to hear that.
Yeah, first we'll go to Kathleen Colbert.
No, thank you. And thanks, Partha, for the opportunity. It's Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. And I do recognize that you're trying to summarize the positions. I think one version of, well, first of all, I want to clarify that Vistra's comments are not reflective in this generators bucket, although we are a generator, a competitive power provider operating within the CAISO markets. It would be helpful actually to hear from you if we are the only generator that took a more, I guess, nuanced view around, I guess how I see it is like our perspective is we need strong penalty incentives that needs to be assessed against the deliverable ICAP equivalent of anything that's sold from a UCAP perspective or ICAP, and to assess at only the shown RA value is undermining the reliability incentives. And we even provided comments that we think the penalties need to be stronger than they are today, and we need to be looking at how to make these incentives more robust across the entire BAA. So I don't and you provided an alternative proposal as well. So I just don't see us in this summary, but I am curious, are we the only generator that took that viewpoint?
No, thanks, Kathleen. I'd say no. I won't. Almost everyone's positions were very nuanced. So I wouldn't say that there was really, most of the positions didn't really fall into easy, black, white categories of like one side or the other on that. For folks who want to reference, I don't know if there's one from Calpine on the call. I think that they had similar positions to you all, at least in terms of how I viewed their comments and viewed sort of, they had other changes that they were looking to the structure and the design, but it's a lot of the same themes, at least I saw. But at least I'd say your comments were not alone, and probably I really appreciate your speaking up here, because you're probably right. We probably didn't adequately capture that nuance in this slide, because I think that was a different position. So yeah, really appreciate Kathleen.
No, I appreciate the clarity. Thank you, Partha.
Thank you, Kathleen. Taking a look to see if there's any questions in the room. I'm not seeing any at this time.
All right, so looking at the first section of our proposal, revised RAME and resource type application. So just a little introduction slide here into the section. So some of the common foundations that we based these rules around that we've proposed. Revised RAME assesses whether shown RA was available during the applicable tier event. For all assessed resource types, penalty exposure would not exceed the resources shown RA. We provide here the resource type treatment and recognize applicable obligations and operating limits, distinguishes controllable from non-controllable unavailability. And as far as exemptions, we retain some targeted exemptions and applies resource type rules to resources below 1 megawatt. And starting with thermal generation, kind of as our baseline dispatchable assessment, and our proposed treatment here is to assess availability during applicable tier event hours against shown RA, using applicable bids, schedules, outage status, and reported D rates. When exposure may apply, unavailable shown RA creates exposure when it's not covered by substitute capacity where required and provided under applicable outage rules or recognized through applicable outage or D rate treatment. As far as VERS, we're looking to vary the obligation with wind and solar conditions. So wind and solar don't have the same day ahead MOO as dispatchable resources, and their market obligations reflect these three items here: available capacity, forecasted generation, applicable real-time requirements. Outputs below shown RA or forecast by itself would not establish revised RAME exposure. So no outage record would be required for things like low wind, low solar irradiance, nighttime solar, other ambient conditions reflected in the forecast. Reportable unavailability, so forced energy and equipment outages or D rates should be reported through OMS. And examples include, these items here: turbine and inverter outages, things of this nature. And our proposed assessment treatment use the higher the day ahead or real-time reported forced or urgent outage D rate megawatt for the applicable tier interval. And revised RAME exposure remains capped at the shown RA. So as far as standalone storage, it remains accountable for shown RA while the market respects modeled feasibility. So the assessment retain a shown RA-based availability assessment using applicable energy bids and outage status, preserve accountability for failure to submit required bids or reportable equipment outages. And the modeled physical limits, nonlinearity would be addressed through the SDM modeled initiative. And there's a call, just a little plug for a call later today if folks are still around for that. And storage would continue to submit its full bid curve. The market would limit dispatch and feasible levels when the resource enters its nonlinear state of charge range. And modeled feasible dispatch limit would not automatically create revised RAM exposure or require an outage card. And for co-located and hybrid resources, storage configuration determines the level of revised RAM assessment. And we have, the three categories here: standalone, co-located resources, and hybrid. So how the ISO sees the facility: co-located, separate VER and storage resource IDs, that share a point of interconnection, and renewable and storage components represented through one combined resource ID. And for co-located resource, each component retains its own bids, outage information, and shown RA quantity. The market dispatch respect the shared POI limit. Exposures is determined separately for each resource ID. And for hybrid, separate rather than separate components, the market sees one resource, and bids, outage status, shown RA, revised RAM exposure are evaluated for the combined hybrid resource. And I think we can take some hands here from I see Perry and
Yep.
Jake.
First in the queue, we have Perry Cervedia.
Hey, this is Perry Cervidio, California Energy Storage Alliance. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Could you go back to slide 14? Okay, so is at least related to the standalone storage, is my reading that there was not really a change in the policy from the prior iteration to this iteration?
That's correct.
Okay, so we had included in our comments that, it seems that the policy then here is that non-linearities should not result in RAM penalties. Is that the underlying policy principle here?
Sorry, you faded out a little bit up there. Could you repeat that, Perry?
Yeah, no, the question is the underlying policy that non-linearity should not be penalized under RAM?
What's that? That's great. I'm going to bring up Sergio to the panelists. I recognize that there's some overlaps with the SMD model solution discussion. So
Well, it's an RA. It's just an RA policy question. I think that's in your wheelhouse.
Well, I understand. We've been coordinating a lot on this piece. So I was going to bring him up to the panelists to discuss it with you. I know that there's been overlapping issues with the model solution discussion and some of the implications of that. And so I was just wanting him to basically be able to connect those pieces. So I appreciate that.
And Sergio, you can unmute now to speak.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I think you're right, Perry. That's the spirit of this slide, really. That when this is properly modeled into our systems, as it relates to our revised RAM framework for generic RA, we would not. It would not create RAM exposure, because once we have that model solution, the market will know how to take in the bids and dispatch the resource in a feasible manner. I think questions related to the treatment around flex or related to what we do prior to implementing the model solution are a bit different, but I agree with your perspective there.
Okay, so then thanks for that, Sergio. So Partha, then the way that I'm looking at, and we included this in our comments, but the way that I'm looking at this is the RA policy, you know, at the close of this initiative will be that nonlinearity should not be subject to RAIM. There are two ways to represent, currently there, I guess, will be two ways to represent nonlinearity. One is through the use of an outage card, because the CAISO has not provided us the capability to represent it in any other way in its market model. And then in the future, there will be a way to just represent it into the market model. But I think what I'm seeing is the underlying policy is that nonlinearity should not be penalized under RAIM. And what we had put in our comments is that that ends up being the final policy here, then, you know, as soon as this would be approved by the board, we should move any modeled or any outage that is related to nonlinearity into a RAIM exempt category in the interim. Do you guys follow?
I follow. David Zlotlo from our legal division can weigh in.
Hey, Perry, this is David. There's a nuance that's being lost in what you just said, which is that when the nonlinearity is modeled in the market, it won't be subject to RAIM because it will be covered through the market. However, without that, it would still, if it shows up through outages, it would be covered under RAIM. And so I don't think there would be an intent to then create a RAIM exempt outage card for this. It would be covered by any modeled solution when it gets implemented.
Okay, can you help me understand what the difference there is? It's the same underlying, representing the same underlying capability, whether it's through an outage or through a modeled solution. And here the RA policy is the nonlinearity shall not be penalized under RAIM. So I'm having trouble understanding how in the interim, we wouldn't just have nonlinearity represented in an exempt RAIM outage if that is the policy. The underlying cause is the same, is what I'm saying.
Well, I don't think that's really the policy. The policy is if it's created, if it's managed through the market model, then there's no need to impose RAIM. But it's about handling nonlinearity in the market. And that's what takes the RAIM issue off the table. It's not purely that we're making some policy proclamation that nonlinearity is just blanket exempt from any RAIM consequences.
Oh, that's what I actually heard Sergio and Partha say, though, is that the intent is that nonlinearity would not be subject to RAIM.
When it's modeled in the market.
Okay, so because CAISO has a deficient resource model for one resource type out of all of the resources in the market, we have to incur penalties when the clear policy is that nonlinearity should not be penalized. Am I understanding that right?
No, I don't think you're going to get us to say our model is deficient.
You are saying, though, that it needs to be enhanced in order to represent nonlinearity, and at that point, we would not have outages. Is that correct?
Okay, maybe can I ask Perry? I recognize that there are, and like part of the reason why I was wanting to defer to Sergio and David on this is I recognize that there are various stages of different PRRs and other requests related to this. I think that like if we can maybe stick to some of the policy discussion going forward and not have a discussion on sort of the current design and what the compliance and appropriate charges are for the current design, I think that'd be helpful.
Okay, so yeah, that's why I started with the policy discussion, and it sounded to me like the RA policy was that nonlinearity should not be penalized under RAIM. I thought I heard that from both you and Sergio.
Yeah, and obviously this is a policy proposal, hasn't been accepted by the board, hasn't been accepted by FERC. We're developing it with stakeholder input, and we're in the we're in the revised straw proposal phase of the policy. So like applying this as a accepted policy that would apply for today, I think would be a little bit of a stretch to say, because we wrote this in a policy proposal, that this is applying to the current tariff and the current practices today. There's obviously a lot of
Oh, yeah.
nuances to this discussion, but yeah.
Yeah, that's precisely why I was asking the question, to say that if the underlying policies do not penalize nonlinearity, and that is then accepted by the board, I would see no reason why we should wait for a modeled solution when we can implement that policy in today's system using outages until we get a modeled solution. I think, I don't want to get too hung up in the details, but I at least allow me to just state one more time before I get off on this topic, and that's just that our position is that, and we've been consistent with this position, that nonlinearity today, because CAISO's NGR model does not have a way for us to represent nonlinearity. It causes us to need to use an outage so that we can accurately reflect our capability to the market model. The outage, in effect, tells the market model what our underlying capability is. And what we're saying here is, when it's in the market model, it should not be subject to RAME. So we're seeing, if that is the underlying policy, then we're seeing an inconsistency here, because the market model needs to see the right availability, and whether or not it's through SDN or through outages, it's representing the underlying capability of the resource due to nonlinearity, and it should not be penalized by RAME, no matter how you implement that, whether that is through an outage or through a market model change. And we see this as a model deficiency for sure. So it's caused by CAISO, the reason we need to use outages. And just as an example of why this is a model deficiency, is you guys have very advanced models for other resource types, like multi-stage generators. And because the resource model handles a lot of the capability to the market, they currently do not have to take outages to represent if they're in a lower stage under that model. So we actually see it as discriminatory treatment between NGR and MSG resources when it comes to RAME. I think all of this is to say that we support the underlying RA policy that nonlinearity should not be subject to RAME. We will continue to support that. We would just like to see that be the policy, and upon board approval of that policy, we can implement that through outages. We can implement that through changes to the market model, however you want to do it. But from that point of board approval, they should be exempt from RAME, because that's the policy.
Thank you, Perry. In the interest of time, we're going to have to move to some other hands. We have quite a few hands up at this time. We can circle back to you later on if we have time. Thank you so much. First, we'll go to some questions we have in the room. First, we have Rahul Kaliskar, and then we'll go to Jasmine Guan afterwards.
Quick sound check. You can hear me, right? Okay. Can we go to the VER slide? And I think it's the previous. Yeah. So just a question about where we are in the process. Is we are defining high-level policy, or we are trying to go into how these things will be interpreted? And I'll maybe explain where I'm coming from.
Sure. Yeah, I think we're right now in the process where we're trying to develop out a proposal to, whenever possible, remove the categorical exemptions that we have under the current RAME design. And so we have a new, our revised RAME has a very different structure, where we believe that we can have a more targeted look at different resource types, and have a application of RAME that sort of doesn't expose them inappropriately to charges, but really applies penalties when appropriate. So we're basically in the process of developing out. And for VERS, I think we're really, the key thing is what we're really looking at is forced and urgent outages. And the reporting of forced and urgent outages is the basis of assessing a RAM design, and to use the shown RA value as the basis of the penalty. And we've had some discussion, I think, with a variety of parties who've thought about what the implications are of this revised design. We've heard some feedback on, maybe what you need to do is look at a more targeted look at, instead of using the shown RA value, which could be, at least as they describe it, inflated for various reasons, using a more targeted look at what their expected output might have looked like during those at-risk periods. And then we're going to later get to some discussion on having a cap on the exposure. And so I think that's something as well that wouldn't apply just for VERS, but apply to all resources, which can minimize it. So I think what we're really trying to do from a process standpoint is hone in on a design that would potentially work well for different classes of resources, including VERS.
So I'll just share some very high level feedback, and maybe we revisit when you try to go into how this would work. Because when I look at the exemptions for VERS, it looks like it's the only scenario it gets a RAIM assessment is when it's on an outage. Otherwise, which just seems a very strange way of saying, you're completely exempt versus you're exempt 99% of time. But in whatever instances you have an outage, you may have RAIM exposure. That's how I'm reading it right now. And coming from a world where maybe a significant fleet is already in operation, and if whichever portion of that fleet has RA, I don't expect anyone when contracting would even think of this framework. So this is going to create a lot of challenge to implement and even think through. There are more challenges to think through as you go into, how do you calculate? So my suggestion would be is you take this in implementation, or like track phase 2, phase 3, once you solve the bigger challenges, unless there is a big concern that you're trying to, it's about fair treatment to every resource. And, when CAISO looks at different options of what should implement, what's the impact, to me, this may be a question of, if you treat everyone fair, but the amount of effort everybody will have to go through to comply will far outweigh the thing that you're trying to solve. So at some point, when you go to calculating how you would implement this, it would be good to do some analysis and say, what's the problem it's trying to solve? At policy level, I'm not opposed, but when I look at contracts and implementation, I just don't see the value of putting the effort towards this than other priorities.
I appreciate that feedback. And maybe could be here, could be in your comments. If you could maybe expand upon that and think about, timelines, implementation, like if you think this is the right, policy direction, it could be saying like, if you're gonna go down this, here's an easier way to implement, here's something that would be less impactful to our contracts, provide us more clarity. I think that we're looking for that type of feedback, because I think that we have the overall objective is obviously we're trying to have a incentive mechanism that incentivizes availability. So, but if there's a way to actually to do it that's in a more reasonable manner based upon commercial and other factors, we'd love to hear that feedback. So.
Yeah, I think I'll make one point and then I'll move on to the next issue. I just don't see any incentive for solar not to generate. So it's not like it has fuel on the other side or any other incentive of not showing up. So that's how I think about it, but I'll include that in the comment. And can we go to maybe storage and then go to hybrids and co-located, please? I like the idea that you have identified the scenarios we need to think through for all of these resources, right? Like the challenge being, how do you manage the shared POI? Now, when you figure out the incentive of how resources actually generate, if at the POI there is competition between solar and storage, generally the idea is you want solar to generate as much and then storage to shift. So how you would think of details on POI, I think will be really critical, especially when you think of how you would implement. I think policy-wise, this makes sense. Similarly goes for hybrid. I see that there is an effort to do equal treatment, but then the decision of what is, how does solar and storage within that components are treated, or whether it's treated on resource level would be important. And this will keep going back and forth on dynamic limits and how resources are managed. And in my mind, if we do not address the core principles for use of dynamic limits, then the devil is in the detail of how you consider hybrid resources, because hybrid resources have their own challenge of operating. So I'll just keep those things in mind. Like some bullets represent a very significant aspect, and it will be good to know, when we would tackle those things.
Yeah, love to get into the details of that. I think as a policy matter, it sounds like we're on the same page of just that concept of if you have a, co-located with a single POI, it's basically the big curve and availability of the separate components. It sounds like there's some other nuance in terms of. Yeah.
Yes, it's basically how you are going to analyze the performance, right? Like that would drive a lot of decisions.
Yeah.
And
obviously it won't be like for this portion, there's like a separate discussion we'll get into later of where we're considering a future phase that would look at real-time availability and real-time performance. And I think that once we got into that phase, that's where I think a lot of the nuances would become a lot more complex, just in terms of if we're no longer just looking at, bids in the market, but we're looking at actual metered output or actual performance, then it could look very different in terms of what the application looks like. But for this phase, it's really more about day ahead availability and day ahead bids in terms of the assessment.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Rahul. Next, we have Jasmine Guan in the room, and then we'll take some questions online.
Thanks, Partha. This is Jasmine Guan from NextEra Energy Resources, and I just wanted to piggyback on Rahul's comments. We do think that potentially the effort to implement for RAIN to VER, the efforts may outweigh the reliability benefits, just because the accreditation values for VERs are already so low today. But we would also really like to see some sort of supporting analysis of that demonstrates how VER force outages have impacted reliability. I feel like the paper, all the figure 4 and 5 is just everything but VERS, so it would be really nice to see that. I also had a clarifying question for just how to see your proposal for applying RAIN to VER. So are you just going to look at the tiered hours that are subject to RAIN and then subtract out any forced and urgent outages and have the remainder be subject to RAIN? Is that how you guys are thinking about it? Or just an example would be great.
Yeah, I'm happy to. Do you want to talk about it, Abdul, or I'm happy to?
Hey, Jasmine, this is Abdul. So yeah, the idea is we would look at show an RA and look at the hour where the tier 1 or tier 2 are, effective, and then we would deduct any, or not deduct, apply this penalty to any value megawatts of the RAIN, of the shown RAIN amount that is impacted or derated by a forced or an urgent outage. So the idea here is if the resource is not, for whatever reason or ambient reasons, that it didn't match its forecasted value and its in performance, that would be not captured in an outage card, therefore would not be imposing a penalty to it. But if the VER resource has a physical outage, something went wrong, they had to shut down or derate the unit, then they would report that in a forced or an urgent outage. Obviously, planned outages have substitutions requirements, so that's why we're not talking about that. But forced and urgent outages don't, and therefore we're imposing that assessment and therefore a potential penalty to it.
Okay. But for the latter reasons, you don't usually have to submit an outage card today. Like,
So you have to submit outages today for physical limitations to the resource.
oh,
So that will continue.
wow.
What you don't have to submit outages today or tomorrow is if there's a deviation from the forecast. A cloud comes in, the resource is not 100% to the forecasted value. I think that's what we're talking about here in the distinction that if there's kind of an operational limitation there due to a forecasting issue, that would not require an outage and therefore would not expose the VER resource to a penalty. But if the VER resource has a physical outage, something tripped, part of the resource is broken, urgent work needs to be done, so it needs to shut down or get derated, whatever that amount of actual physical outage impacting the RA capacity, that's what we're proposing to
Subject
expose to
to-
penalties.
Okay, thank you.
Which is that's kind of consistent with the rest of the fleet. That's what we're trying to say, give the VERS consistent treatment or exposure to the penalty structure, right, like the rest of the fleet, while recognizing the uniqueness of the VERS when it comes to their forecast and following it.
Thank you, Jasmine. Next, we'll take a couple of questions online. First, we have Jake McDermott.
Good morning. This is Jake McDermott with TerraGen. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thanks. Thanks for the presentation. I just have a couple comments I wanted to make this morning. On the hybrid configuration here, I think one thing we'd like to see at TerraGen is a little bit more detail on the specifics of how this would work. It wasn't clear to me from reading through the paper, for example, how we would ensure that the hybrid isn't penalized for the VERS if the VERS are not available. And I think kind of hitting on some of the other comments I've heard so far this morning, there's these interesting, operational considerations for hybrids around SOC management and how to kind of manage your SOC using different features. And we've previously been instructed to not, use dynamic limits for that purpose, and that introduces just some complexities. So it would be really helpful, I think, in the future to have a little bit more detail in the paper on how this would work for hybrids. And it's probably also a good moment in time to also think about the PUC is going to be looking at a hybrid methodology for UCAP, and the challenge right now is that all of the outages can't be disentangled from the individual components. So we may need to think a little bit more about how to get individual component level outage data in the future as well, and that might help as well some of these particular complexities on assessing RAIN.
Thank you, Jake. Next, we have a question in the room from Carrie Bentley. Go ahead, Carrie.
Hi, this is Carrie Bentley with the Western Power Trading Forum. I just had a clarification, I guess, and maybe I just missed it. So we're moving from a bid-based assessment to an outage-based assessment. Is that what I'm picking up here? Because today, right, it's were you supposed to bid, did you bid, and it's assessed on the bidding side. But the way you just described it is that you're going to use actual outages to determine noncompliance, right, which is a big shift from today. And is that the proposal?
The VERS.
I carry this, Abdul. We're doing both. So we're keeping both bids like RAMPD today. There's bids and outage derates. In this, I was giving an example of how a VER, because today VERs have a blanket exemption. So how would a VER tomorrow be exposed to RAIN is through really realistically an outage derate. But yes, if they don't bid, then that's also an exposure.
Okay, yeah, it's just, I know it's a very nuanced kind of technical point, but you end up with different outcomes, whether you measure availability based on outages versus on bids, because not everyone has a generated bid, and especially for solar, I think the way you framed it is a little I think you will get a different outcome. So maybe maybe have an example next time on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the things that we'd recognize and got feedback on is we expect to get a different outcome. Like right now, we're using outages in shown RA. And obviously, if it was a bid based upon forecast, either for wind and solar, that could be different than what the shown RA value is. And so that's one of the things that we teed up for discussion was sort of recognizing there might be a more nuanced way which we could do the calculation of what expected output look like for VER resources. And that there's sort of some question of like maybe it's that the shown RA value is too high or there's a different value that should be shown for different periods. That's sort of one feedback that's been given. Another is whether or not you can use sort of a more updated estimate of what that value looks like, sort of approximate what the bidding quantity for VERs would look like. So I think that's yeah, of course.
Sorry, I think that confused me a little bit more because when you said today we use outages, do you mean currently or do you mean today in the proposal we use outage?
Today in the proposal.
Today in the proposal.
Sorry,
Okay, all right. Thank you.
Thank you, Carrie. Next, we'll take a couple of questions online. First, we have Kathleen Colbert from Vistra.
Great, thank you. Kathleen from Vistra. Since we're on I did have 2 points or 2 questions. Since I'll do the verse first and maybe go back to the higher level one. Yeah, that was really helpful. I do want to echo a call for an example. I tried to read through the proposal and listening to this conversation, I'm also struggling to fully comprehend under different types of scenarios what their actual target would be under your current proposal. So if you could do that in the next iteration, that would be really helpful.
No, I appreciate that. We can take that feedback and think about how to do that.
Yeah, that would be great. Like maybe a scenario that focuses on outages only, a scenario with the bid only, as you discussed, and then one that has both of them to kind of show the complexity of how you're envisioning you would look at it when there's both difference in bidding and an outage in place. That would be helpful.
Thanks for the feedback.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. I do, wanting to be mindful that the penalty incentive framework, I don't think it's appropriate to think of it as like governing the LRA's qualifying capacity approaches. So I'm trying to keep them very separate, but I would say that listening to that conversation that you've had so far, it does. I heard you actually, I wrote this down, Partha. You said if the shown RA is too high. And so I do want to be careful that we're not like conflating those two issues, right? So if the concern is that the QC that you're receiving and you're seeing it, and you can show it through analytics and data is quote unquote too high or too low, then I really also encourage that we keep that issue in flight at the LRAs. If it's a specific LRA QC that we're seeing a persistent difference from what you would quote unquote expect on a real-time basis. Let's make sure we have the feedback loop back to that process so that you can make a proposal to refine those approaches and really kind of look at this framework as incentivizing availability on an operating day perspective as we need it.
No, appreciate that. And just to maybe clarify as well, if I sort of misspoke, I was really trying to paraphrase feedback we had heard from resources when they described it as being too high in terms of the shown RA value. And I think when they were saying too high, I think what they're really showing is saying that the shown value is probably the way I look as both higher than say the ELCC value for the resource, as well as maybe higher than what the expected output might look like during those hours of risk. And so I think that's the reference I believe that some of the renewable resources were describing, and that there's obviously a difference sometimes between what's being shown to the ISO versus how it's being contracted and or shown, for example, in the CPUC slice a day framework. And so where there's a more nuanced showing based upon the 24-hour profile. So I think that was really what I was describing when I say too high, was more of a paraphrasing of the feedback that we received from certain renewable parties.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that. I mean, that's useful information, that parties have communicated to you that the QC values are inaccurate for their resource type. Um, that's important information for the entire stakeholder community to think about that. And when we return back to QC proposals next iteration, I think if enough resources are coming to you with concerns that the shown RA values are too high relative to their actual operations, I think that's actually a really meaningful flag for a reliability concern we should be focused on. But if I could take that and move back to the higher level question. So on the slides here, you have changed your proposal from the last iteration where your proposed frame megawatt target was the deliverable, was some version of like the, what I interpreted to be the deliverable ICAPS equivalent of what was shown. In this proposal, I'm understanding that you've changed that to assessing RAIM against the shown RA value, regardless of what term that value is shown in. Can you clarify that?
I'm not sure I fully followed that. No, Sergio or Matt do it. Otherwise, maybe I'll have it. Do you have it?
Yeah, so we're looking at basing it
I
on the
can
shown
ask
RA.
it. Yes, and that's shown RA. Your expectation would be that some shown RA would be shown in terms of forced capacity, and some shown RA would be shown in terms of installed capacity, and some shown RA would be like VERS for exceedance. I just wanted confirmation that that's your expectation.
I think across all resource types, we understand that there might be different methodologies that LRAs use to show resources to the ISO. So yeah, I think that's fair.
Yeah, thanks for confirming. I think that's really important. Because the next clarification is that how should we be, and I think you do have a slide, so I'll put this in a parking lot. And when you come back to it, would encourage us all to think, I'm thinking about that, not from the perspective of different resources, but from the perspective of I have sold my resource to multiple different types of LSEs in different LRAs, right? And so it's a single resource. And if your proposal now is that the shown RA could be different across that same operating range and valued in different terms, that is incredibly complex. We do have illustrations of why that's very challenging, and will have potentially adverse outcomes of not translating them into a apples to apples comparison, and we'll put those in our written comments so that we can continue to discuss it. I did also want to note, Vistra does oppose this concept, and we've been very clear about that because of these adverse outcomes. We provided an alternative proposal in our last iteration of comments to set the frame megawatt target to the balancing ratio share of the deliverable ICAP. And I'm happy to present on that proposal in a future meeting if you would like. Thank you.
Thanks, Kathleen. We'll move on to the next question. Just a reminder to folks to keep your comments and questions as succinct as possible so that we have time to hear from everyone without running over today's meeting. Next, we'll go to Paul Nelson.
Hi, this is Paul Nelson with the CPUC Energy Division. I've got a question on slide, I think it's 14. No, 13, page 13. On the VERS. One more. So the proposed assessment treatment is to use the higher the day ahead or real time reported for forced outages. Can you provide a little more logic on that? Because I would think that you would want to focus on what's available in real time.
We could, and we discussed that. I think there certainly is merit to using the real time only for VERS, because if that's the applicable must offer period, I think it was really a matter of if they had already shown them to be on forced outage going into the day ahead market, that could have impact on the
will affect the
on the
day-ahead
market
it will,
price.
yeah, it affects the IFM run. Yeah.
Yeah, it wouldn't directly. So I think it's fair feedback. I think maybe I can ask, is your idea that basically we should be looking really at the real time only, and just in terms of if we didn't look at, if in effect what you're saying is instead of looking at the higher of, we looked at the real time only, then in effect if a VER resource said they were on outage going into the day ahead market, but then in fact were available in real time, then that would be the application of the RAIN would be just based upon the real-time availability. Is that what you're getting at?
No, I was just want to understand more of the logic, and I think what you're going is day ahead affects the IFM run, and real time obviously affects the real time runs, and forced outages affects both outcomes.
Yeah, that's it.
I mean, was it 90% of the money settled day ahead? Is that still about accurate?
I don't know if I have an up-to-date number.
Yeah. Okay, I was just trying to understand the thinking on that one. Thank you.
There certainly are various spillover effects to a resource having a forced outage day ahead, even if it's available in real time. It's a question not just for VERS. I think that's a question that's been applied to all resources of whether or not we should, in effect, give some sort of credit or, in effect, I don't know the right term, forgive the day ahead exposure if the resource actually becomes available in real time. For VERS, actually, there's obviously a nuanced difference of why that might be appropriate. That's different than other resource types, but I think for the sake of this proposal, I think for simplicity, we decided to have it be based on the higher of the two. But I think if folks have feedback or feel like it's more appropriate just to use the real time number, I think we'd be certainly open to hearing those arguments.
The resource is out day ahead and then comes back online in real time, it unwinds the impact. Yeah, okay. Something to think about.
Thanks, Paul. Appreciate it.
Next, we'll take these last couple of questions and then move on in the interest of time. Next, we'll go to John Martindale.
Hi there, this is John Martindale representing American Clean Power California. First, just wanted to thank you guys. This is a meaningful improvement on the last draw proposal. There were a few more issues I wanted to talk through. I had a couple questions. First, I wanted to echo Rahul and Jasmine in just wishing there was a little bit more justification information brought forward to support the value of applying RAIN to VERs. I think CAISO has provided sort of the conceptual justification, but all the information I've seen is that outage rates for VERs are typically quite low. So it's not clear to me what issue this would be solving, and more analysis on that to back up this proposal would be really helpful to see. I think my first question is focused on this slide here, where revised RAIN exposure remains capped at shown RA. And this is, I think, the point that Kathleen was getting at, where there's a concern that the shown RA value is too high here. And I just want to talk through that a little bit with respect to solar in particular, where at least the exceedance-based value from CPUC is aligned with the gross peak hour, which is just sort of, that's how CAISO's RA system works. And, that's just an hour where solar has a particularly high generation, and that resulting QC value is just not reflective of the RA value of solar. It's not reflective of contracts. And so aligning, calculating volumes based on that number is just sort of fundamentally misaligned with the reality of how solar participates in the RA market. So I would be really interested in working with CAISO and maybe just getting some, brainstorming right now, if possible, on how we could other information sources we could use. One possibility is CPUC. They do produce an exceedance profile, which gives different values for each hour. And so that would more accurately align with the actual RA value of the resource in that hour. It's also my understanding that CAISO generates its own forecasts on a generator level. And I'm just curious, whether CAISO is considering using that type of information for this calculation, and sort of what obstacles might prevent that type of implementation.
I think we're looking at this point for some more stakeholder feedback. I think there are various tools that could be used to have a more accurate calculation. It could be a different way that people are showing different values. It could be using some other data to perform. Here's sort of a class-based estimate. It could be a more resource specific. So there's a variety of ways, but I think we're looking for that feedback right now on, is this reasonable or close enough? Maybe I'll sort of touch on your original point around sort of VER availability. So I think that we've gotten this feedback really, I would say, across lots of resources, and there's a lot of sort of question around, and I think that it's sort of seen as there are a lot of resources that, in effect, do all the needed maintenance that they're needed to be available at a high basically at a high reliability value. If we're in an emergency condition, almost always we'll see resources doing what they can to come back and to become available. And so I think that there's been, across a variety of resource types, have been asked those same questions about what is that incremental value that this is providing. And I think that for VERS, the same kind of questions are coming up around why do you need this? We have strong incentives as well. I think in general, I think you're probably right, and I don't think that we would disagree with the availability or whether or not these incentives. I do think there are specific cases where you'll see there might be a resource on outage. There might be some, especially when we're in really tight conditions. There's kind of a question around, do we have proper incentives for all resources to take actions to be available? And so I don't think it's meant to imply that, VERS as a class are not unavailable or are not available or not performing well. But I think it is sort of seen as we probably don't have very effective incentive mechanisms within the context of the ISO to really focus in on availability during some of these key periods. And there can be some spillover effect to reliability. And so I don't think this is really applied to VERS or any one resource type, but that's sort of the general philosophy. So a lot of the aggregated data that we can provide would likely show, hey, this resource class is performing well, and we could do that for almost any class. But when we get into some of the specific resources and specific examples, we might see, hey, this is a resource, and I won't pick on any type, but there'll be some resource that might not have kept up with all of its maintenance to be reliable at the level that we expected, or might not be come back from outage. Might be shown as RA, but not really doing what's necessary to come back from outage in a timely manner. And so it's not that all resources are doing that, but we feel like part of this design should address kind of those general incentives to be available. So I think that's some of the philosophy around it. So appreciate it. Appreciate the question.
Thanks. Thank you for that. That's helpful. And I do have one additional question on the treatment of hybrid and co-located resources. I think that's on slide 15. But so I'm just going to talk through. I think I understand how this would work. This proposal would work for co-located. Essentially, the proposed storage RAIM rules would apply to the storage component, and the VER rules would apply to the co-located solar, for example. But I don't understand what this proposal, how it could work for a hybrid resource. Is it that both would apply? Yeah, could you just provide a little bit more clarity on that?
Yeah. Do you have any comments on that?
And Sergio, you're available to unmute at any time.
Yeah, sorry, could you repeat the question, please?
Hi, yeah. I think I understand the co-located resource where, there's different proposed RAIM rules for VERS and storage, and those different rules would apply to the parts separately because they're, separate resources that have their own visibility to KAISO. But for a hybrid resource where it's a shared visibility, a shared resource, would both rules apply at the same time? I'm trying to understand what would take precedent there.
I think part of the nature of the hybrid resource, at least the majority of them being a renewable and a storage component, is that they'll have their own shown array value. They will be submitting bits and outages for the totality of the resource. So really the spirit here is that the assets would be assessed to their ability to meet their obligation based on that shown array value, given their outages and bids. So in that sense, the rule, let's say it's closer to what we would think of as a standalone storage resource. The difference really is that this resource has it's not just storage, but basically what we're trying to say in the table is that under the revised RAIM approach, we are viewing it and thinking about it as a single asset with a single obligation based on that shown array that can be met with its bits and outages, and that's how it'll be assessed. So there's no, let's say, disaggregation of the responsibility or the exposure to the underlying components. Yeah.
Thank you, Sergio. And we're going to have to move on to the final question from Mary Neal. Go ahead, Mary.
Hi, yeah, this is Mary from ARM. I think we already touched on this in response to John's question. But I just wanted to be sure. I've been doing my best to follow this proceeding over the years, but I just do feel like may have missed something here because obviously FERS have this blanket exemption for RAIM, and that's been KAISO's policy, and now KAISO's proposing to move away from that. And I just want to be sure I understand all the reasons for that. So perhaps you could just explain in just a couple of minutes, like, was there some change or some data that came through that is causing this that I missed, or is it just a more general concern with, resource, maintenance and availability?
No, I mean, I wouldn't think that this initiative was designed around VERS or VERS availability. So I think that we had an extensive working group discussions. I think that one of the things that came out of the working group was a discussion on why might RAIM not be as effective as we want? And that one of the things that was discussed was that there are a lot of exemptions. And so it's applying to certain resource types, but not others. And for each resource types where exemptions were applied, there were pretty good reasons. And a lot of that had to do with sort of the design of RAIM, the application to availability assessment hours. And then for different resource types, there could be the case where they're saying like, hey, I'm accredited via a different methodology that really accounts for my variability. Yes, I'm not available. I might not be available during the RAIM assessment hours, but I have this other methodology that's applied by the LRA that sort of captures my non-availability. And so then I think there's sort of, there's a number of factors from the UCAP design that's being applied at the PUC to accreditation, to different accreditation methodologies, and kind of a desire of like, hey, can we relook at this as we revise RAIM to have a little more of a broad treatment of remove some of those categorical exemptions, but replace it with a little more of a targeted look at what is expected for good performance for the resource, and apply it really just on the basis of what good performance for a different resource types would look like. So it really wasn't meant to target VERS per se, And I think that what we're really doing it here is because we're sort of changing that paradigm where we're not just looking at bids and availability during a defined RAM assessment hours, but looking probably more at some of those at-risk periods, and then really targeting as well based upon what the expected performance would look like for different resource types. We feel like this is a reasonable way to sort of capture it and eliminate most of the categorical exemptions that were in place previously. So.
And Mary, this is Abdul. Just to clarify what we're doing, I think the concept Partha explained very well. We're not changing the impacts of the forecast to and exposing it to penalties. So what we're saying is what is happening today and is staying tomorrow is if the VERS forecast, let's say, drops to 0 in a given hour and RA is 10 megawatts, that's not going to expose the VER to a penalty because that's the forecasted value. So we recognize the VER's uniqueness in that aspect, that they will follow their forecast and the forecast can vary. It might be higher or lower than shown RA. So what we're saying is the impact, we're not going to penalize them if the forecast drops below the shown RA. What we're saying is if the VER, due to the reasons that Partha talked about, if the VER experiences an outage, just like any other resource, something is wrong with the resource plant issue, and they need to shut down or get a derate, we're saying that would expose the VER to this new penalty structure. Again, similar treatment to other resources. We didn't see a reason to continue to provide an exemption for such scenario. However, if you guys think that we missed something, we're all ears. Please, this is the time to tell us we're wrong. Thank you.
We have a question from Noah.
Yeah,
Go.
just a follow up on this, what you just said. Can those things happen at the same time in the sense of both a forecast to 0 or very low, but also in a physical outage, which would then come first? I think that's the question, uncertainty.
That's a very good question. Oh, Partha, you have something?
Yeah, so I think that's one of the things that we were sort of teeing up for discussion. I think that's what we've heard from some of the renewable developers is the idea of like, I'll pick on solar for a second. Like, let's just say we're having an emergency event, but it's at night when the solar's expected outcome would be 0 anyway. But you're also having a forest outage. So I think that's sort of like the dual application of like, if we look at a more granular look at what your expected outcome output might look like, we'd have a more accurate representation of here's what the impact is associated with your forest outage. And so I think there's been some questions of, is that a better methodology or not? It certainly would add, there's probably a variety of ways to get at that. We could have, different shown values hypothetically to capture some of those differences. It could be using some other tools to estimate it, but I think that's what the discussion we were having earlier on. If we're just basing it on shown RA, it might not reflect, as you described, that chicken. It almost sounds like a chicken or egg thing of like, well, even if I wasn't on outage, it wouldn't have affected my, I still would not have been available during those times. But is that what you're getting at, Noah? Thank you.
And yeah, we have a quick question from Carrie.
Carrie Bentley, Western Power Trading Forum. I just have an observation, and that's that the way you describe this is complicated and will require a bespoke service by you guys, right? It's not just your normal systems. You'll have to do a lot of changes in your own systems to implement this. It will open up potentially every single solar and wind contract right now, which is very expensive to the market because now you're adding potential costs that weren't accounted for when these contracts were signed. And you have provided really no data evidence that there are widespread outages by solar or wind that are impacting the market. And I appreciate, you talking about the working groups, but discussions are not a substitute for data analysis and justification. And my fear is that you go through all of this, we go to FERC and they reject it because you really haven't provided good evidence that it's just, reasonable, necessary. So I would just put this, I don't disagree that in an ideal world, everyone would have equal treatment. I actually agree with you guys there. I just would ask you to ruthlessly prioritize what you want to do. And I would just put this so low down on the list that I'm wondering maybe you just save it for later.
Yeah, great. Thank you. For the sake of time, I think we'll run through the slides a little bit. I don't know if we'll have time for a break.
Yeah.
We'll see. Yeah. Yeah, so moving on to hydro treatment, reflecting both water availability and operational control. For run-of-river hydro, it's a similar logic to how we plan to treat VERS. So capability reflects expected water availability and expected energy. Forced and urgent plant outages are reported in OMS and used in the revised RAME assessment, similar to how we just proposed VERS for dispatchable hydro. Treated like a thermal resource when water and operating capability are available. Bidder scheduled a portion of shown RA that is physically and operationally available during the tier event. The one thing with dispatchable that we seek feedback on are how we could recognize water budgets and release limit and release requirements, environmental restrictions, licensing requirements, and use limited conditions. And for the final slide of this section, participating load, metered subsystems retain their exemption. Demand response retains program-specific treatment, and resources under 1 megawatt follow the applicable resource type rules. And as far as participating load, CDWR left pretty comprehensive comments, as well as all other stakeholders in the last round. And due to their load-specific test, would need to reflect underlying pump load, day-ahead non-spin participation, and real-time load drop capability. Availability depends on pumping schedule and whether load is available to certain conditions, and a conventional RAME test does not capture. As far as demand response, revised RAME would apply when a tier event overlaps with the DR resources designated availability assessment hours, and availability will be assessed using the existing tariff for program obligation for each DR resource type, including applicable dispatch limits, event limits, emergency-only provisions, and other operating parameters. And we propose to remove the under 1 megawatt exemption. All right. And moving on to the third part, our tier assessment. So tier 1, as we've proposed in the past, is an early warning signal with a price based on the day-ahead LMP. The changes here that we've implemented are a daily rolling study from T-8 to T-4, which is more of an advisory period, where the binding period is T-3 to the trade date, where the CAISO forecast demand plus reserves plus an uncertainty buffer is greater than available RA. Upon the T-3 binding period, confirmed assessment hours would not be reduced. And the buffer calibration determines how often tier 1 triggers. A minimum assessment hour floor may be needed to preserve the incentive strength as well. And we seek feedback on both those portions of this equation for tier 1. Tier 2, critical upward insufficiency triggered by EDAM RSE failure narrowed to the upward and ramp insufficiency. Tier 2 focuses on this portion of the RSE failure because these conditions indicate that additional RA capability is needed to meet system requirements. And here we're comparing shown rates with bids in the deficient interval, and we're keeping the proposed $2,000 per megawatt hour penalty level, and tier 2 does not require tier 1 designation. And this is just an example of what it would look like in the market. So T-8 advisory begins, the ISO begins a rolling operational sufficiency review for trade date on 5/5. T-4 is the final advisory date. The ISO continues to refresh forecast, reserve, outage, and available RA information. The T-3 binding confirmation, operational sufficiency trigger met. ISO identifies stress hours for the trade date, and the trade date assessment tier 1 applies only to identified stress hours, and the penalties based on the day-ahead LMP. And this is a piece in the paper explaining some of our logic behind the tier 2 charge. A fixed tier 2 charge provides a consistent incentive across RSE events. And so the RSC surcharge varies with market conditions. And this is kind of a simplified example here where the EDAM RSC surcharge reflects the difference between the Mid-C and Palo Verde reference price and the applicable CAISO day-ahead LMP credit. As a result, the surcharge can change significantly with the bilateral trading hub price spread, even when the RSC deficiency and RA shortfall are unchanged. So here in this example, a $2,000 megawatt hour, the same 20 megawatt RA shortfall produces the same $40,000 charge in either price spread scenario. This fixed design provides predictability and avoids tying the availability incentive to potentially volatile bilateral prices. And so charges, payments, and potential bounded penalty exposure. So these past 3 sections that we've gone over are the most substantive changes from the previous iteration. And so RAIN penalty revenues are shared between load and available RA resources. So this is just a little figure displaying that. And what we see feedback on is an alternative approach to the Tier 2 penalty revenue allocation. So currently we're looking at the same structure for Tier 1 and Tier 2. However, some stakeholders expressed that collected non-availability charges could be treated separately due to being tied to the EDAM RSC failure, where these charges could be used to offset costs allocated to the CAISO VA. And another portion that we seek feedback on is if these penalties happen to exceed EDAM RSC failure costs, how should these funds be allocated? And these are some examples. So this is in the paper as well. I hope folks have had a time to absorb the paper, but this is what it would look like for a simplified 1-hour event in Tier 1. And so we have a non-availability megawatt of 10 megawatts. The Tier 1, the day ahead LMP is $100 per megawatt hour. And we have load during that hour of 45,000 megawatts and eligible available RA during that Tier 1 hour of 50,000. We calculate the per megawatt allocation rate by dividing the Tier 1 collected charge over the total allocation base, and then prorate that per resource class or per load and eligible generation. And what that would look like on the individual resource level, here we have just a simplified example of shown RA being 100 megawatts with a Tier 1 shortfall of 5 megawatts. And so non-availability charge of 500, and then eligible RA allocation quantity just under $1 here. So it would be the available megawatt times the per megawatt allocation rate, which was in the previous slide. And so this was kind of something that we wanted to bring here, and we hope to incite a little bit of discussion surrounding this. So this idea of a bounded penalty exposure, which we talked about a little bit in the paper that we just put out on Friday. And so our objective with this bounded penalty exposure is to provide greater certainty regarding potential monthly financial exposure while preserving a meaningful incentive for RA availability during tier events. And so these are just a couple of examples of what that might look like. So there could be an event-based limit to establish criteria intended to limit how many tier events can produce charges within a month. This could include a minimum number of chargeable hours or a maximum cumulative number of tier event hours. Or it could look like a monthly financial cap, which would limit cumulative monthly charges to a specified amount. The cap could potentially be expressed as a percentage or multiple of the resource's CPM capacity payment, and would protect against high exposure tail risks when significant resource failure coincides with numerous tier events. And this is something that we've talked to a few folks over the last week about, but we'd be interested to hear any feedback in the room or in your comments on this topic. And we'll provide a place for this in the comment template as well. Yeah. So for the last slide in this section here is pertaining to our Flex RA alignment. Can be managed through an interim bridge while the system RA framework moves forward. So what we're thinking about here is as the system RA RAIM framework is enhanced, the existing flex array performance framework creates this sequencing issue. And what we recommend here is retaining the flex array showing requirements and associated moves, but suspending flex specific penalties for a transition period. And our reasoning behind this, it avoids penalty stacking, commercial challenges of alternative design options, allows time to develop longer term flex array solution, and avoids incremental RAME implementation development, and recognizes the evolving market and commercial structures. There are a few other alternative paths that we work through internally, being maintaining the current flex array rules, redesigning flex array now in parallel with system RA, and delaying system RA RAME maybe be the cleanest integration, but slowing track 2 progress.
Okay, now we'll take questions, but before that, I just want to note that in the interest of time, I want to make sure we leave enough time for Carrie's 45-minute presentation at the end. So we'll be limiting folks to asking one question at a time, and then you can rejoin the queue if you still have additional follow-up questions. So first we'll go to folks in the room. First hand raised was Lauren, so we'll go to Lauren.
Hi, this is Lauren Carr from CalCCA. I had a question back on slide 19, and I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about the uncertainty buffer and how that would be defined.
Yeah, I think this is a little bit of a work in progress. We're also going to be looking for feedback from you all. I think that there's probably was a question in our mind as we develop this of whether or not we should use just public data and public information in providing this and have a very clean line. I think that we are recognizing that there is some uncertainty in terms of how many forced outage rates, what load looks like as we go in, particularly from the when we look at T-8 to T-1. Often we might see an increase in the number of forced outage rates as they occur. There might be uncertainty associated with weather and what those conditions look like. And so having it just be a clean line that said, hey, we're going to compare shown RA, for example, to the projected or shown in available RA to what we expect the weather to look like, might not capture all the uncertainty. There could be sort of normal variance, or it could be sort of more like normal trends in terms of what the outage rates look like and the variance in that. So I think that uncertainty buffer was meant to sort of capture some of that amounts, but I think that's something that we're going to be looking to maybe provide more detail and refinement with as we move forward. So
Thanks. Yeah, it would be good to define the methodology so that we can evaluate how often tier 1 triggers, like you said, the buffers, what's going to determine that. So as we evaluate the proposal itself, it would be good to be able to do that with the uncertainty buffer established.
Thank you. Next, I believe we had Carrie, or was it Noah?
Mine's very brief. Carrie Bentley with the Western Power Trading Forum. Back on slide 23, you were talking about the allocation. And just because, Matt, you're new, I wanted to make sure everyone was reminded about the 2012 cost allocation guiding principles that we routinely use in stakeholder initiatives to make sure that we're allocating revenues according to market economics and incentives and good principles. So it's an oldie but a goodie, and it holds up. So I recommend looking at that again.
Yeah, I will just say, just so you know, I actually did go back and read through them. It's good to go through archived history around. I think I will say personally, I felt that they do hold up, and I think that it's a good basis. There's obviously a variety of objectives we're trying to achieve simultaneously here. I recognize that partly it's fair cost allocation, partly it's providing effective incentives, and this is kind of the cross section of the two. But I still think that sort of fall into the bucket. So I appreciate, for the sake of the ISO and stakeholders, you're pointing it out, Carrie. So thank you.
Thank you. And next we'll go to Noah, but I just want to note, apologies, we are running through our 10-minute break because we're running a bit behind from the volume of questions. So next we'll go to Noah.
Noah Tom from Middleware Power. Can we go back to slide 19, or at least the topics of slide 19? When you talk about day-ahead LMP, are you talking about it at the P node for each or somewhere else?
I think there's a variety of ways. We didn't define it here. I think there'd probably be like, there's different basis when one could do it. One could imagine doing it at their actual location. It could be like a hub price, or it could be the sort of the system marginal energy cost. I think that's something we could get feedback on as we move forward. But I think that there's various trade-offs between any of those proposals. Right now, we have it at the day-ahead LMP, which could imply that it's at a resource-specific basis. But I think for the sake of implementation, I think we'd be certainly think about easier ways to do that.
And then the forecast demand, is that a peak demand, or is it on an hourly basis for that day? The CAISO forecast demand plus reserves plus uncertainty buffer.
It would be the hourly forecast for that day. Kind of think of tier
so
one.
You have an hourly forecast, but then you're comparing it against a one static available hour RA value, roughly speaking?
We're comparing it to an hourly operational RA value. So for each hour, what's the RA value minus the impact of any potential D rates, outage D rates? For the VERS, we're going to use their forecast. So basically, we're trying to reflect the hourly capability of the fleet and compare it to the hourly CAISO forecast plus the reserves and the uncertainty. Think of today's outlook trend that we have today, the RA trend on today's outlook, the 7-day trend. Very similar, might be that one actually. And then there's a buffer here, so.
Right. And then is tier 2 on top of tier 1? Can a single resource get both penalties?
Can they, if we have tier 1 and tier 2, I think we said no, right? Or
okay. No. All right. Thank you.
Thank you. And before we go to the online questions, I did want to note, if we get through these questions quickly enough, we'll have time for about a 5-minute break. So next we'll go to Kathleen Colbert.
Thanks, Christina. Kathleen from Vistra. So we submitted robust comments on the last iteration. The reason that we provided an alternative proposal is that Vistra cannot support the direction that CAISO had previously proposed, and this is largely status quo relative to that last iteration. Just to be super clear, we oppose the idea of loads receiving being involved in the allocation of a performance incentive design that's meant to incentivize resource performance. We oppose including the EDAM RSC failure surcharge in this. We provided comments saying we support your goal of including generators in that allocation, but let's separate that and keep that separate and distinct because it's not appropriate. It's not directly related to this performance incentive design, so keep it separate. We oppose you establishing a penalty in energy terms as opposed to capacity terms. And we also oppose your tiers, the way you've refined that. The questions here have already indicated why it will be difficult and administratively complex to kind of understand them and track them. We provided an alternative proposal in the spirit of cooperation with the CAISO. My question for you is that cooperative spirit mirrored, or you have any interest in allowing stakeholders to discuss our alternative perspectives on what would send a robust performance incentive, or are we moving along without taking those into consideration? Because I don't see any of our comments or ideas reflected.
No, I mean, well, first of all, absolutely. We obviously have, Carrie and WPTF had requested to present. I think they're going to present a number of different alternatives to both the design. I read through the presentation very quickly, so I'm not going to capture it well. There's going to be some discussion on the UCAP and the framework about how we can align the program design with the UCAP. Others sort of more targeted towards this proposal. I think we're always looking for ways to refine it. So if we will certainly, if in a future, we'll go through your comments again, Kathleen, appreciate your feedback, but I think that we were, for the most part, we incorporated a number of different changes from stakeholders, obviously not every change, but if there's one in particular that you want to discuss here, love to hear more about it.
Thank you, Kathleen. Next, we'll move to Renee Steichen. Go ahead, Renee.
Yeah, hi, Renee Steichen from Rev Renewables. And my question, I think it's on the tiers, I guess, whatever slide that was. But I'm just thinking about this from a storage resource perspective. And so just want to clarify that this is in the day ahead and, just how you're measuring availability. Is it if there's a bid in any hour of any sort, whether it's to charge or discharge, meets the requirement here? And then just because I don't want to get muted before I ask my last question is like, if there's a real-time true up component of it, just making sure that there's still the incentive out there to follow CAISO dispatch signals, and that we wouldn't be penalized for that. But just want to, I guess, be clear on like how we would meet the offer requirement here. Is just having a bid of any sort in any hour. Thanks.
Sergio, do you want to jump in here?
Yeah. Well, today for generic RA, the obligation to offer is based on the discharge. In a day ahead time frame, a bid curve that includes the charge and discharge segments ranges is sufficient to be able to be optimized in day ahead. In real time, similarly, if the bid includes the discharge range, it would be fulfilling that obligation to make that available. Yep. I don't know, Partha, if you have anything to add there.
I think that you covered it.
Thank you. Next, we'll go to John Martindale. Go ahead, John.
Hi, thanks. John Martindale, representing American Clean Power, California. Yeah, first, well, I guess I only can ask one question. So I think the main question I had reading the revised proposal was on the calculation of the allocation base. The example that was given was a 1-hour event, and it provided an hour of RAIN penalty collections and an hour of load and total RA availability. I'm curious how that would work for multiple hours. Would multiple hours of load and RA be added, and multiple hours of penalties be added and create one number for all hours, or would that be calculated separately for each hour?
Hey, John, this is Abdul. I think we're proposing to the calculation for each hour separately. So each hour would have its own penalty structure based on the failures in that hour.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. Next, we'll go to David Oliver.
Yes, just, can you hear me? I'm sorry.
Yes.
Yeah, just David Oliver with the CPC. Just for those of us who are not as involved or knowledgeable of EDAM and the RSA process, if there was a way to provide some sort of links to resources or where we might be able to find out more to learn more about what would trigger this tier 2, that would be useful. I don't need an explanation here for it. I just I'm not that familiar with it, so I'm not exactly sure what would happen here. I'm just hoping that somewhere there can be some maybe reference material for us to use to understand it better. Thank you.
Thank you.
No, we can think about how to. I'm happy to follow up, David, and provide some of those reference materials. There's obviously various materials on the website just in terms of how the EDAM processes work for the RSC and the cost allocation and sort of the crossover effects. I think those is probably where the discussion would need to happen, but I'll work with our reg team to follow up with you. And maybe before we move on, I know that now I'm encroaching on the break time for 5 minutes, and maybe we can take a few minutes afterwards. We have a whole discussion on added substitution. I want to touch on more on the previous slide, and so discussing kind of the bounded penalty exposure. This is something that we had, I think, fairly broad consensus on from stakeholders, is the need to have something in place that this could create a high risk. And so like, I think they're having a little bit of discussion around, like, is there a way to, assuming we're moving forward with this proposal, how would we actually develop this? And if stakeholders have any ideas around this? There was some high level feedback in terms of what the objective should look like. Within the paper design, we talked about, potentially having it be, we had like an EG, which is, obviously just more of an example of, could be a multiple or percentage of the CPM soft offer cap could be one way to look at sort of what the bounds might look like on the penalty exposure. But maybe after the break, we can take 5 minutes more to see if there's any feedback on that before moving on to the other topics. Yeah.
Okay. So with that, we'll take a quick 5-minute break and then return to this discussion. Hi, everyone. Welcome back. We'll be getting started here again on a discussion on bounded penalty exposure. So I'll turn it over to Partha and Matt.
Yeah, I just want to take another, potentially like 5 minutes just to see if there's any thoughts on this. We don't have to stay here. We have a couple more topics to discuss pushing forward, but particularly on the bounded penalty exposure and/or our proposal on the treatment of Flex RA for a transition period. I thought those might warrant a little more discussion before we move forward. Both of these, I think, were particularly on the Flex RA as well as this. This is, we're trying to be, responsive to I say broad stakeholder feedback around, on Flex RA. So some of the implications of potentially having a dual construct where, particularly if we had kept the application of RAME to Flex RA, but applied this to system. There's a kind of a broad consensus of that being not the best design option from a commercial standpoint. And then for the bounded penalty exposure, a sense of like to the degree that these charges are applying, the methodology, whether or not this could create a risk that could, in effect, be detrimental from a commercial standpoint, from a contract standpoint, et cetera. So I thought I'd take a few minutes just on those last two topics to see if there's any feedback, if we got them, or particularly the bounded penalty exposure, if there's a desire for certain participants to, focus in on a proposal on how you all think it could be applied, and for Flex RA, if we got it right, or if there's other questions that people have. So I'll just pause there. See.
We have a question from John Martindale. Go ahead, John.
Hi, John Martindale with ACP California. Yeah, quickly, I'll say that I think we appreciate the proposal to suspend penalties on Flex RA, but my question is just about understanding the bounded penalty exposure. I think I'm seeing this proposal is bringing up the idea of a minimum number of hours, and I think I'm looking for clarity on a few aspects of that. One is that a minimum number of hours every month, and then the second is just kind of more on the justification of it. I think I read the DMM's comments on the last drop proposal, bringing up the idea that if there aren't enough hours with penalties, then a resource, I might not be getting this right, but a resource might be incentivized to bid into the market without intending to be available. And so there needs to be a certain amount of penalty exposure in order to make sure resources participate correctly. Is that the correct understanding for why there should be a minimum number of hours? So yeah, I'll leave those two questions.
Sure. I'll touch on the minimum first. The minimum probably wasn't the key to the bound that I was going to discuss. I think the minimum was probably the flip side, where we heard from a number of participants that agree that there might be very, very few hours. This might not be serving as an effective incentive mechanism. So by like how we'd actually do that, there's probably a variety of ways we've thought about internally. This could be a part of sort of that uncertainty calculation where it's in effect, when you're heading into a year, it's like creating a minimum number of hours would be kind of tricky because obviously you don't know what the system conditions are going to look like for the rest of the year or the rest of the month or whatever period you're analyzing. So it could be sort of just applying, saying, hey, well, we're going to look at certain conditions and like what we'll expect it to look like, I'll make up a number, 100 hours where we're going to be looking at like tier 1 type conditions. And that sort of backing into, here's what we'd expect the, supply margins to look like during those hours and to have that be the basis of the calculation. So I think that's sort of one option that was sort of floated by participants for having a minimum. I think we're more thinking about what the maximum would be, probably less in terms of a maximum number of hours, but more in terms of a maximum dollar exposure, just based upon the feedback of participants of not wanting to create too large a risk to that. So yeah, love to hear more from you, John, or others.
Next in the queue, we'll go to Rahul in the room, and then we'll take a final question online.
Thanks. I'll think through both the financial cap and then the minimum limit. From a financial cap point of view, I think those events are so far and few in the industry, if you look at across markets, that it's really difficult to generalize what works and what does not work. But there are specific examples of what not to do. And if you see what happened in PJM during, I think it's Winter Storm Elliott, that gives a pretty good example of what not to do when one specific incident could wipe out, say, 40 or 50% of the capacity. So after that incident, I think there was a lot of focus in PJM to come up with a cap. Now, this is a delicate balance of how high you want the penalty to be, that is a deterrence. At the same time, it does not create a scenario where you completely wipe out the market because you thought, that's a good idea. So I would highly advocate to continue building this approach of having a cap. What that caps look like, I think we still need to think through, but I'll come back to that maybe in our written comments. The minimum number of events sort of defeats the purpose of having tiers, and would love to see if there is conceptually worth going down this path of having minimum chargeable hours. And the idea would be is like you have to do a lot of work for something which may not be a problem. Now, unless there are situations where people are not available, you could add something like surprise testings and so on and use that as a process rather than adding more to a situation which doesn't warrant a lot of work. So I would try to balance those two things.
Thank you. Next, we'll take the last question online from Paul Nelson.
Hi, this is Paul Nelson with the Energy Division. On the event-based limit, are you thinking about this at the resource level limit or?
Paul, your audio is coming in a little bit shaky. Are you able to get a little closer to your mic?
Is that better?
Yeah, that's better. Thank you.
Thank you. This is Paul with the CPUC Energy Division. So for the event-based limit, are you thinking that this is at the resource level or at the program level?
I think we're thinking about this like when we say event-based limit, where we have like these tier events. And so there's kind of a couple of different ways to look at it. One is sort of like for each one of the tiered events for a resource, they might be hit with penalty charges associated with non-availability. And so the limit could be sort of viewed as what is the maximum exposure a resource could have associated with being unavailable during some period of time. So it could be, it's not necessarily during that specific event, but it could be over the course of a month. It could be over the course of a year. And is there a way to sort of cap the exposure in a manner that creates more certainty in terms of what the maximum impact could look like associated with non-availability?
Okay. So it sounds kind of like the resource. So you could have some resources that reach their limit, and then if the situation is triggered, then some resources would then still be subject to it.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think that's all our questions, unless Rahul, is that an old hand? Okay, thank you.
I will just say too, just so you know, the fact that we didn't get more, FlexRA has got so many comments. So the fact that I didn't get more FlexRA comments, I know I recognize that now when I'm saying this in your written comments, we're getting a ton of comments on people's FlexRA positions, but we had a number in the previous iteration. So I was actually expecting to have a lot more. I don't know if it was support and or opposition to it. I expected some people to say like, hey, we want broader changes to Flex RA when we do it faster, but I'm more now teeing it up for people's comments if they want in the future, but I don't know if Rahul, if you're just taking the
I'm just
bait
going to
or.
make one comment. I think
Yeah.
we were looking forward to completely eliminating Flex RA. And I thought that would just open a new can of worms for discussion. That's why I didn't bring it up.
Yeah.
But I'll leave it there.
That sounds great. That's good transition to our next topic, but yeah, really appreciate the engagement. Absolutely, yeah. So I should take success. Maybe it's my own error in bringing it up again, but yeah. It's good.
Yeah, sure. All right, so this is kind of the last section that we've made some changes to in the newest iteration of the revised TRAP proposal. So this is kind of introducing the bidding requirements and the must offer obligation. So evolving accreditation methods can reduce market visibility into available RA capacity, and this is kind of a principle we've been standing on as we go through these iterations of RAMPD Track 2. And so what's changing today is LRA accreditation methodologies may assign a resource in NQC below its physical operating capability. And if we have a MOO set equal to the shown RA, an accreditation D rate may reduce the capacity visible to the ISO market. And the resource may remain physically capable of offering additional capacity, even though less capacity is shown. So looking at what the framework needs to address and what we're proposing here in the MOO is resources that are only partially shown as RA, resources with partial capacity deliverability status, resources shown under multiple LRA programs, and clear separation among the must offer obligation, revised RAM exposure, and substitute capacity requirements. And so the proposed MOO, which is the same as what was proposed in the previous iteration, would be shown RA times the PMAX or PMAX equivalent over the NQC. And this preserves a relationship between shown RA and operating capability. Nice. I think we only have about 10 minutes left. So did I go back? Yeah, sure. Yeah, this is just the last slide for this section, and then we can talk about that after you present. So the MOO preserves operational visibility without expanding revised RAM exposure. So the bidding obligation, when NQC is below PMAX or PMAX equivalent, the resulting MOO may exceed shown RA in some cases. For partially shown resources, the MOO is reduced proportionally. Revised RAM and substitute capacity. So this is something that stakeholders had questions about in the previous iteration. So revised RAM exposure remains based on a shortfall below shown RA, and substitute capacity requirement also remains tied to shown RA. And offering at least shown RA but less than the MOO would not create additional RAM exposure for the megawatt above shown RA. And in our application section of the paper, we highlight the framework applies to dispatchable system resources. For multi-LRA resources, the calculation uses the resource's final NQC, total KISO BAA shown RA, and the applicable PMAX or PMAX equivalent. And VERS and resources governed by separate tariff, forecast, or program-specific rules retain those requirements. And as far as our proposal on substitution and outage definitions, we haven't changed really anything. We just provide some more clarifications in these sections in the paper. It's still the same proposals as the previous iteration with respect to planned, off-peak opportunity outages, forced and urgent outages, where planned outages require substitute capacity. And for the shopping cart approach, this is just, we just added some further clarifications here. And so from contract board to transaction workflow, today's substitution is largely manual. The bulletin board posting provides notes and contact information. SCs must identify counterparties, negotiate bilaterally, and execute a contract, and then enter the substitution into SIRA. The proposed shopping cart structures selection through a KISO platform where sellers posting RA eligible capacity by date, megawatt, price, and applicable terms. Buyers filter and select capacity through a streamlined workflow within SIRA. After seller confirmation, KISO removes the sold capacity from the pool and applies the substitution. And contracts and financial settlements remain outside of the ISO. And That's that's our presentation for today, and we're happy to take any questions. I know we have a few minutes left before Harry presents.
Looks like we have a hand raised from Noah.
Hi, Noah Tom from Middleware Power. Can we go back to your move slides, page 30? And so when the PUC adopts or has, I guess, adopted UCAP, in here, do you envision changes to also EFC and how local capacity is counted to be based on UCAP? Or would those values still be based on PMAX today, as they are today? So take an example as we get into 2028 for UCAP. If I have a 100 megawatt resource that is also 100 megawatts of EFC, if now I go down to 90 megawatts, does my EFC come down to 90 megawatts as well? Or are you looking for the range to go up to PMAX? And similarly for local RA, how would that all work? Have you guys thought through?
Well, I'm not going to answer the question did you guys thought through it? But I'm going to say that as the current rules apply in your scenario, so UCAP, I think the PUC is proposing to apply to thermal and storage. So for thermal, the EFC is capped at NQC. So now the thermal resources get a cut because of their UCAP methodology. That will cap the EFC. So there will be a cut to the EFC automatically applied when we do the EFC calculation, unless these rules change.
Yeah, hey, just really quick point of clarification. This is Kevin Head from CAISO's California Regulatory Affairs team. I think the most recent PUC decision leaves it open as to whether the qualifying capacity values that they'll provide to the CAISO as a local regulatory authority will reflect the UCAP D rate. Will it be the 90 megawatts, or will they give us a QC that's still 100 megawatts? So that's TBD.
Okay, but I mean, if the assuming the QC that we get reflects the UCAP value methodology, and that sets the NQC. Today, the EFC methodology that we follow to calculate EFC caps for the thermal fleet, at least caps their EFC at NQC. So there will be that impact. Storage, I think today are not capped at NQC. So unless we change the EFC rules, they're not going to be impacted.
Yeah, I mean, sorry, Partha. I mean, like, this is a huge conversation.
Yes.
I have a slide on it.
Oh, well, okay.
Can we wait?
No. I will not yield my time.
Big conversation.
No, the reason is I'm thinking about is under UCAP and under system RA, we have an LLE methodology or LLE study and so forth. So it takes in consideration the types of plants and so forth. For Flex RA, I think you guys don't actually do that. It's more of a it's more of just like, how much is the 3-hour ramp? And we look at how much we need. So it's a different type of calculation to get to. And so I would like to say that you guys should think about, the accreditation for these resources matter based on sort of the type of studies you guys are doing in order to meet the 3-hour ramp requirement.
Yeah, and maybe I'll speak. So Noah, maybe I'll speak, and this is probably like you're really crossing over between probably 3 different separate processes going on. Obviously, the PUC's processes going on for UCAP. We're having an evolving. We have our own structures, as well as we're reconsidering sort of what to do with Flex RA, as well as maybe like how would this work in practice under the tariff today. I would just say for the long-term policy, I think this is something that I think with respect to Flex RA, we probably could need to consider as well in terms of how evolving values might affect our Flex RA program and design. And so I think we can take that feedback, at least in terms of the long-term policy implication on how we design any potential changes to Flex in consideration. In terms of maybe near-term implementation, I think that probably is a separate discussion in terms of how our tariff works today and how the application would work under our existing tariff. So that's something that maybe we can take as a separate process as well. That seems like it's maybe out of the scope of what this initiative is trying to address.
No, I mean,
Same point. I have a whole presentation arguing this point.
fine.
Okay.
So I know we have a few hands up, but Carrie has some slides that are relevant to this discussion. If you all can hold those questions until after. Go ahead, Chris.
Chris Devon, Calpine, Constellation. Okay, I just wanted to touch on the short notice opportunity outage issue, which we did not really talk about here. But CAISO's proposing to remove that. I don't think the proposal has changed on that. No, it has not. Okay, so we commented previously in writing, and I did not comment during the meeting in verbally previously, but I just want to do it verbally here so that everybody else hears it and highlights it, because I think that the reasoning that CAISO is using to justify removing short notice opportunity outages is a little bit flawed, and essentially is trying to say that those outages need to be assessed by RAME, and that the urgent outage that card type, or urgent outage category type, I should say, that is under the RC definitions is a better use of or is duplicative. And I think that they are different things, and we should keep the short notice opportunity outage, because the OEs do study the impact in these short outages that are, come up where it's in the forced outage time frame, but they can be scheduled to do maintenance over the evening, nighttime periods that are not affecting reliability. And the OEs would not allow those to be taken if it was actually going to impact reliability. So in that case, it just doesn't make sense that, we need to be exposed to RAME in that situation. But setting that aside, under this new RAME paradigm, and I think I want to focus on the likelihood that these type of outages under urgent would impact our UCAP values in the future is the problem that I want to highlight, because we should not be impacting a UCAP value or accreditation for these units if we are really not causing reliability impacts. And so if we were allowed to take a short notice opportunity outage overnight to do some maintenance on something that just broke, and it's not going to actually impact reliability, I think that's the principle that I want to get across. That means we really should try to consider the need to keep this kind of a short notice opportunity outage category where it doesn't necessarily impact the UCAP counting. I think we would be okay if it's still going to be exposed to RAME. Right now, it's not exposed to RAME, right? It's exempt from RAME. But I think the likelihood that would impact us on those kind of outages is very small, right? Because you're not going to actually let those outages occur during any type of a reliability period. The OEs would say, oh, it's too tight. We can't take those units offline, even during the nighttime or whatever, which wouldn't trigger under these new proposed RAME conditions either. So few things there. I know that's a lot, but I just want to say it verbally so that everybody hears it. And I think CAISO should reconsider that part of the proposal in the future. Thanks.
Just a clarification, Chris. So you're saying potentially keep the short notice opportunity, even if it means exposure to these two-tier new RAME replacement kind of thing. I think the challenge, you're right, they always do study these, but do we have sufficient headroom from an RA perspective on a system-wide? Like, if we start allowing too many of these off-peak short notice opportunity, even if it's at night, eventually it's going to get tight. And tight not from a local reliability perspective that they always are running, but from a system perspective where now it's just supply and demand, and we're cutting too much into the supply. I think that's the concern. Even at night, that could become a concern. You're right, it's very unlikely, but it could become a concern. We don't have a rule today that says short notice can be only taken at night. I guess that could be a modification instead. But today, they can take it anytime during the day. And if we are, and there's obviously timeline of submission and stuff, but if we see that there's no local issues, we can let it go. I think the challenge is the system. And if we allow too many of these, and now we have a shortage in the system.
Okay, yeah, so exactly, Carrie. So I hear you, Abdul. I think you could, look at these during the middle of the day when there's a ton of solar and it's similar. So I was just using the nighttime period as an example, but I think it could be in any period where the OEs don't see any reliability concern. And then also, I think it would be pretty easy to just look at the system-wide forecast and the available RA numbers that you guys actually even publish on the website. So I think you guys could just add that part of the check as some small modifications to be able to keep this kind of an outage type, which is a benefit to reliability because it's going to cause us to be able to have more opportunity and flexibility to do the maintenance in a nearer term and then not get dinged in the future on our UCAP. The UCAP piece of it is the problem, I think. And obviously that's not all settled out. But this urgent outage type, I feel very confident that the CPUC will say that one, any type of urgent outage is going to have to count against your UCAP design. But if we could convince the CPUC not to assess UCAP on short notice opportunity outage, it just gives us a better opportunity to do that maintenance in a time frame when it doesn't impact reliability and still keep that option for that flexibility in the shorter term time frame within the 7-day forced outage window, rather than just removing that completely. Thanks.
In the interest of time, just I would say ditto all the concerns that he raised. And the other thing I would say is UCAP is going to have so much more impact on the system than the availability discussion that we just had before, that I think spending more time on this topic would be really worth, or at least including that in the justification for why that is being removed. I'll go back to the original discussion for flex array, and I think there are a lot of questions about accreditation that is not like a policy question, but that hasn't been discussed in the past that needs to come up. And Carrie, if that's in your presentation, I will really love to wait, but I'll put the question out there. You can address it when you are presenting, or Partha can address, is what is the EFC for storage? And what counts as, how do you calculate that? What's the justification and the various flex categories? So just revisiting that and then education would really help. And Carrie, if you can address that in your presentation, that would be good.
Looks like we have Noah and Lauren's hands up still.
I actually had a question related to the moo piece. So should I hold that? No? Okay. I guess my question was on the interactions between the moo and the revised RAME on page 32. I was wondering if you could explain the rationale behind revised RAME exposure remains based on a shortfall below shown RA. So the moo would still be up to like the shown Pmax, but the RAME would be up to the shown RA, even if it's based on like a statistical methodology. Okay. And I don't have a position on that yet, but could you explain the reason for the difference?
Sure. I think there's obviously a variety of different methods. It really was probably more of an implementation and an LRA deference issue. We recognize the fact that there might be a variety of ways in which different RAs showed resources. And so like, let's just say, for example, like on the UCAP discussion, like we had a discussion on, there's a variety of ways that we could do it. We could use just the UCAP number and assess, any sort of RAM exposure based on that UCAP number. It could be the case where we used like an ICAP number, or like the ICAP being sort of the proxy. We say for like the Pmax. I'm going to say, I'll use ICAP, basically just saying like, this is the amount of ICAP capacity that was being shown to us. We could use that as a number. Or we had this idea of a performance benchmark where it's neither the UCAP or the ICAP, but it's something that accounts for things like ambient D rates for thermal resources, full back and nonlinearity for storage. And is that the right value? And so we had a good discussion on like, which one, there's various trade-offs between those three different values. for the sake of, I think, more of implementation, and we felt like it captured at least the vast majority of the impact, we felt like we could just use that shown RA value for the implementation aspect of the RAIM exposure, and based our assessment based upon that shown value as part of our proposal here. But I think we recognize as well of there could be other ways to do it, and there could be other ways that we could could impact it. We thought this is a fairly small percentage, like where in effect the difference of it might just look like, say 5%, in terms of like what a given resource would face in terms of the different exposure, but it would still have a fairly high, like even if they were showing, let's just say a UCAP value, and that's where we're using to assess it, they'd still have the move for the full amount of the capacity of the resource. It would just be that small difference that would not be exposed to an additional RAIM charge associated with it. So that was kind of more the thought was, I think, administrative ease in terms of that, and maybe not necessarily that high of an impact in terms of that incremental value. So anything else I missed, do you think?
Okay, thanks.
And I believe Noah has a question, and then I'll turn it over to Carrie.
Yeah, sorry to get in front of Carrie again. Noah Tom from Middle River Power. We've asked many times for a timeline of these new definitions and how they're applied for planned outages, urgent outages, and forced outages under RC. I don't think the team here on this side understands what those look like, if they're going to be different than the 7 days. If we're still talking about the 7 days, the 7-day window and submission, those would be helpful to have that in the paper or the next meeting, so that it's clear, because I personally don't think RC is on the same timeline as the current outage substitution submission windows for classifications of planned versus forced. When you say on your portal for the ISO, that you will, after the seller confirmation, CAISO removes sold capacity from the pool and applies the substitution. Does that mean that from that point on, the ISO will take that and automatically do it? There's no sort of touch points by the generators themselves, and it's an ISO aspect, to-do item for substitution.
Yeah, I think this is Abdul. I think we're trying to say is, because we got some comments questioning the usefulness of the shopping cart. So we're trying to explain what we think is the added benefit, because some people compared it to the bulletin boards. Thank you. Bulletin board is just Craigslist, basically. You post, you put in, hey, I need this, whatever free form comment. People might see it, they might not see it. And you still as a generator, you still have to go and, like, there's a contact info, call that person, and then go into Sierra and submit the substitution. So it's something that we have, but it doesn't maybe help you a lot and make your life easier. The shopping cart, the goal of it is hopefully to make your life easier by doing what? Providing a more streamlined process in Sierra itself. So the generators would go in that have excess capacity that they want to offer for substitution. They would go in, they put the megawatt, these are my resources, the megawatts, the price, and the period they want to offer the resource, the capacity, their contact info. So now everything for the buyer, people who are looking for substitution, they can see everything in there. The days that, and Sierra will build automation in Sierra to help them kind of filter out the relevant, offers that they can use. They pick the ones they want, and then the buyer, and they hit submit. A notification goes automatically to the seller. It's like, hey, you've been selected, whatever. And then you go in and you hit approve. Once you hit approve, that substitution process, we're going to build automation for it to take effect. So that's the end. You don't have to go to the existing screen of substitution, whatever. So the idea is, we're providing in the platform where you submit substitution, we're going to give you the functionality to find it right there. and then we'll take over some of this mundane stuff like the notifications and the application of the substitution. Maybe it's not a lot, but we think it's a step to help you guys, the generators specifically, in the substitution process that we recognize is not a fun process. But yeah, love to hear your thoughts.
Okay. Hopefully we can talk about that more in the next workshops to develop it a little bit more. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we'll turn it over to Carrie Bentley at WPTF for her presentation.
Thanks so much. Thank you to the CAISO for letting me present on this, especially because they had a leap of faith and weren't exactly sure what I was going to present on ahead of time. So I'm Carrie Bentley. I represent WPTF, which is a nonprofit trade forum dedicated to competition and transparency. I run what's called the CAISO committee along with Callie Wells, so you're usually hearing from me or her. The goal of this presentation is twofold. The first is really a pitch or a plea to the CAISO to augment the scope of this initiative immediately, to do what a lot of you have surfaced today, which are to really implement across the systems changes that are needed to account for the new UCAP methodology set by the CPUC. And I go into a lot of, I'm so sorry, it's a little bit of a boring detail. I tried to use fun colors. We'll see. So that's my first goal. My second goal was to highlight the RA market impacts of the RAIN proposal and really to look at it within the broader context of how will this impact RA prices? How should we look at this going forward? Because I think that's the key to looking at RAIN. So my first slide gets to why I think the CAISO needs to address UCAP implementation immediately. You know, you write in your straw proposal that the ISO is responsible for ensuring that capacity shown as RA is visible and operationally available in the ISO markets. And you go on to talk about that in the executive summary. And that's true, but I think that's an incredibly incomplete definition of your responsibility as it pertains to RA. If you go through the tariff and BPM, you have significant obligations to administer LRA programs, I would say efficiently, effectively, reliably, all those words. And UCAP affects the entire RA architecture, not just narrowly RAIN issues. So I think given that, you know, UCAP is going to be adopted in the 2028 RA year in terms of implementation timing, in terms of when we need to do all this detailed work, the time is right now. And I want to emphasize that if the ISO does not do this work, we are going to be in a place in 2028 where RA contracts have uncertain prices, obligations. People won't really know what they're buying or selling. The ISO won't have clear rules around really important things like how much capacity is available for export RA, what is available if you need to CPM, all these other systems that RA touches on, even things like transitional measures. What is your overlapping capacity for your imbalanced reserve product? RA touches so much in our market that once you change something as fundamental as a megawatt counting capability and start doing it as UCAP, you have to evaluate the whole architecture. And so for those of you that maybe aren't following the CPUC as closely, this is just an overview slide of what is going to happen in 2028. I think people are pretty familiar with UCAP now because the CAISO was proposing UCAP for a long time, so I won't belabor that point. I will make, though, some observations about what it means to move from a PMAX to a UCAP value. So first, what it does is it moves the expected forced outage risk out of the planning reserve margin and into individual capacity counting rules. This impacts 80% of the CAISO capacity. So this UCAP, it's not just some of your capacity, it's 80% of it. And it applies to all the capacity by the CPUC jurisdictional LSEs, which is 92% of the capacity. So the UCAP megawatt is already discounted for expected forced outages, but it still assumes that the full PMAX is going to be offered into the market. And I think your MOO is aligned with this. And then the UCAP at the CPUC is based on PMAX, but I want to just highlight off the bat that when we start using the word Pmax, that's not really the right term, right? Because Pmax is not always fully deliverable. So that's something that we'll have to address here and over at the CPUC. And so we really need a new term. And I would argue that term starts at the CAISO. And you need something that talks about deliverability. So I think maybe it was Vistra or someone who suggested PMAX RA, SPP calls it accreditation. There's a ICAP. There's a lot of different ways you can call it, but basically it's your PMAX adjusted for deliverability. And so when we start talking about even your MOVE formulas, I think that needs to be updated. Otherwise, you're not actually able to assess partial deliverability, which the CAISO has a lot of. And I think this is a small change. So this is the MOVE formula, and then you could just switch it to PMAX RA. So this is probably the simplest of our proposals, but I think what I'm trying to do at a broader level is illustrate that it's not easy. It's not just, oh, you have one formula. You have to think about the nuances of what the terms actually mean in terms, oh, we're moving, Noah. Sorry, Noah's moving the table. What they actually mean in terms of contribution to reliability and within the CAISO's architecture. So in order to help maybe forward this conversation along, I started to break out kind of post UCAP values and how we might start to think about these. So we have Pmax, which is the installed capacity, and that's always going to be our starting point. And then we have our Pmax RA, which I just talked about. This is ACAP or accredited capacity. This is basically what we would think of now as the NQC, which is the maximum an LRA can set its QC value. It's a little different than the NQC, but really what it's saying is it's the Pmax adjusted for deliverability testing, and it reflects the actual deliverable megawatts, the maximum amount that a resource could provide. And then from there, it's up to the LRA to do an LRA specific QC. And they could set that QC according to the CAISO tariff at whatever they want, but it has to be capped at that Pmax RA. And that's an important concept as well. And then now we go into the CAISO's proposal, which is basically what our existing NQC is right now. And that's the maximum QCs across all the LRAs where the different LSCs subject to the LRA jurisdiction has shown that capacity. Basically, most of the time, the CAISO defaults to the CPUC's rules for NQC, unless another LRA comes in and says, hey, wait, I have a different accreditation, and then it can move that value only in the upward direction. Doesn't happen a lot, but it does happen. And so you do have to keep this maximum QC definition. And then finally, you have what is actually shown as RA. And unless you get really clear in your architectural systems which number you're using and make those numbers all very transparent, in particular the ACAP or PMAX RA number, I think it's going to be really challenging for contracts, for the CAISO, for the architecture. Now, I'm not going to go through this in detail. I think there's been a lot of good conversation, and I'm hoping to save some time at the end. So I'll just say what this slide does is it begins to map whether NQC can still perform the function or not. And I used the CAISO's kind of initial proposal within all of these, but then I added, you have to think about CPM deficiency cure, export RA, transitional measures, generated bids, all these things. And I have a very detailed appendix at the end that has a recommended starting point, and it says, hey, please, in this initiative right now, can we start mapping this? Can we implement this well in advance of 2028? So there's a clear idea of how everyone is getting paid, for example. Most RA contracts refer to the NQC. And if the NQC changes, if you change the definition for it, or you change how it's calculated, that has a huge impact on every single RA contract. The must offer obligation, export RA contracts are being signed in record numbers right now. And if you accidentally haircut them by using the wrong number in here, again, you're going to make one, the rest of the West very upset at you, but two, it's inefficient and you're going to risk reliability. Then the next one is mostly a blank slide because, as Noah says, we haven't talked about this yet. How are you going to change your local and flexible RA? Note, I don't say here, will you change it? you have to change it. I would argue that anything you submit at FERC that does not update your Flex RA and your local, you just are immediately subject to a 206 filing. Because when they change how shown RA is calculated and they make such a big shift in terms of contribution of that megawatt to reliability, that megawatt is not the same megawatt. A UCAP megawatt's contribution to reliability is not the same as a PMAX generated NQC contribution to reliability. And if you say for local, for example, you keep the exact same requirement and you just, say now you need 20%, 15% more capacity in that local area because the CPUC decided to change how they calculate their NQC, that doesn't make any sense. And I think that's what Noah was highlighting. And you're going to look really short in all your local areas too, because now you're going to have insufficient capacity. Like if you do the math and you use shown RA values according to the CPUC's calculation, and you keep the local requirements exactly the same, there are not enough megawatts to meet that requirement, period. So we don't want to do that. Let's not go there. Let's not trigger the CPM. Let's think about this ahead of time. And by ahead of time, I mean right now. We need to deal with this right now. And flexible RA, I'll echo Rahul on this one. If you're not willing to just get rid of it, you have to adjust it. You have to say, how is storage going to count? Are you going to cap it? And, I heard Kevin talk about, what the CPUC is doing, but local and flexible RA are in the CAISO's tariff. You have full jurisdiction over both of those products, and you can't just kick it down the road to the CPUC because the CPUC adopts what you propose, hopefully. Sometimes there's a discrepancy, but regardless, your tariff has to be just and reasonable because you have jurisdiction over it. And so again, this is my plea that, next meeting, we address all of this. This is incredibly important and we need a proposal around it. And again, now, we need a proposal around it now. All right, so I'll pause there. That's the end of my UCAP implementation plea. I'll see if there's any questions, comments.
Looks like we have a hand raised from Rahul and Abdul afterwards, and Partha.
Hi, this is Rahul with AES. I like the presentation that you have. Those are all the same issues or concerns we have. I just make one more point about QC. There are changes to QC related to fallback in the latest CPUC update. And my read is that should be included in the PMAX RA discussion. So would love to hear your thoughts on that. And I also want to make a plug for Kathleen. I think in her presentation at CPUC and maybe submissions to CAISO has had similar distinctions. And we haven't seen a venue where those topics are being discussed. And I'll just make a note for the supplier side. We are seeing there is a significant impact to existing contracts and future contracts. And we are still struggling to get more clarity of what the world looks like. And it looks like we haven't tackled all of these issues. So I agree with you, would love to see something happen sooner than later, especially before the end of this year, because a lot of new contracts or people are figuring out how to adjust their contract based on the latest CPUC rules.
Next, we'll go to Partha and then Abdul.
Oh, I'll just reply really quick. On the PMAX RA in relationship to storage and the foldback issue, that maybe we could talk about that in the storage initiative after this. I actually think the way, and I was convinced by Jake at Terragen about this, that the way the CPUC is proposing it is wrong, given the CAISO's definitions for it. So we have a whole host of issues there we have to fix, but let's kick that to storage.
Well, sorry, this is Kevin Head from California Regulatory Affairs again. The PUC's decision says that energy storage QC is being kicked to the next track of the RA proceeding too. So that's still up in the air.
No, they adopted maximum continuous energy minus continuous energy divided by 4, right?
I mean, you can look at what's open issues identified in the decision, and energy storage, the energy component of the qualifying capacity is still up for discussion in the, If you disagree with the
So-
decision, I wouldn't blame you, but
Okay,
I'm
I'll just mention two
just saying
things.
what it says. So.
So in the proposed decision, there was a note about adjusting your QC based on the fallback. And then in the final decision, it said it's not effective immediate, but effective 2027. So maybe there is still time. And I don't know if that goes to track 2, but that's my read. And like that's why I said we need to have.
Yeah, I think it's fair. I think that like for the sake of, appreciate you, Carrie, you're bringing up these issues. I think this is a bigger, a different scope. I think what you're proposing for that that you cover, and maybe that's the key message is you're advocating for a further scope in terms of either this initiative or some other forum in order to address these topics. But I had one specific question, so I'll just go ahead and continue on. You brought up deliverability with respect to the MOO. I think that we had some question like, is there a reason why, like, let's just say that there is a deliverability haircut associated with it. How do you think that should translate into a lower MOO? So let's just say they've contracted with a resource for 100 megawatts, and we do a deliverability study that cuts that to some other amount. Is there a reason why you'd think that that's an important topic that needs to be addressed in terms of saying like their MOO actually is lower based upon a deliverability study that identifies from a capacity standpoint, you might have a lower accreditation value?
I think maybe I'm misunderstanding. So I'm able to just restate what I believe is maybe the CAISO's stance, which is that you want all RA capacity to be deliverable and go through a deliverability study, including the MOO portion of a resource. So not just through shown RA, but the MOO. And I have slides on this next, so maybe we could hold that because we talk about that in the RAME design.
Yeah, Rockwell, thanks for raising the flag, Carrie. I think a question about the MOO, but before I do that, just from a conceptual perspective, I think the PUC have changed their QC methodology over the years with the different resources. This is maybe the first time thermal resources now they have a change in their QC with the move to UCAP, or at least the first time that I know of. So that's probably more than a decade. But methodologies change. PUC or other LRAs, they have the jurisdiction to assess QC and change methodologies. The CAISO is not in the position to change these. We do coordination, we talk, what does make sense. But from a jurisdictional tariff perspective, we have to take those QC values, and I think we have to build a program at the CAISO or rules that should work with or be implementable, effective, regardless of the QC methodology. Otherwise, every time an LRA changes a QC, we have to change the structure, which you probably recognize that's very hard to do. I think with UCAP, because again, significant number of the fleet, it's thermal, first time change, I think where we have the thermal now, thermal fleet is being impacted. We're going into detailed examples of how UCAP is impacting our processes. And I think adjusting the MOO is mainly driven by that UCAP methodology. I don't know if we can do that every time a QC methodology happens, but I think to your point, we can do a better job and we probably should. I think that look at all of our processes and make it clear in the paper, and maybe next time how they're going to be impacted. I know we discussed it internally. I think we have pretty good idea. Maybe we didn't have do a very good job in putting that in the paper. So these are kind of high-level thoughts for you to think about and like the challenges that we face. And then I think I had a question about the PMAX RA as well. I think what we were thinking is yes, yeah.
Again, so I think what you just said is important, and I think you are in a tough spot, an incredibly tough spot that no other ISO in the world is in, because you have to give up the jurisdiction to multiple LRAs.
Yep.
It's not even like Texas or New York ISO, right? Your obligation is to uphold reliability and administer varying and conflicting LRA programs. And so when different programs change their QCs, I would argue that you are obligated to update your program per the tariff to ensure reliability and maintain just reasonable tariff conditions. And just changing methodology isn't really what's happening here. What's happening here is UCAP impacts 80% of your capacity, and it takes out forced outage risk from the PRM, and it puts it on the generators. That changes their incentives to bid, which means any programs you have around incentives have to change too, right? That's why we're talking a little bit about RAME right now, I like to think. And so I understand that, yes, the jurisdiction to, set these QCs, yeah, it does belong with the LRAs, but you have a tariff obligation to administer it and maintain just and reasonable practices. And it's hard, and you're going to have some conflicts, and you're going to have to do the best you can. And there's no perfect way to design this, but you still have to do it. And I still really argue you need to prioritize this. All right, please go ahead.
Yep, thank you. Agreed, and I think that's like you said, main driver for RAME reform, main driver for the MOO discussion and adjusting the MOO because it's a very impactful QC change. So now I think when it comes to the deliverable PMAX, what we were thinking is not tying the MOO to the deliverable portion of the PMAX. And why did we do that? I think so. The equation we have there, which is just looks at PMAX and QC shown RA.
Mm-hmm.
The outcome of it is, so the top one is what we have in the proposal. What does it mean? It means the portion of the NQC that's shown as RA will be translated into the proportion of the NQC full nameplate, and that's the MOO. And the reason we didn't, and I think yours would account for deliverability in capping the MOO, right? I think if I'm correct if I'm wrong. If I'm understanding
maybe can I unwind a little bit?
Yeah.
So where this stems from is actually the CPUC, because the CPUC says they're basing their UCAP on PMAX, but PMAX can include an energy only portion.
Yep.
So if you allow that to continue at the CPUC, you are saying some portion of energy only resources can count as RA. I don't think you want to do that. The CAISO has a long-standing history of saying it has to be deliverable, which means you need a way to communicate to the CPUC which portion of the PMAX is deliverable. And that's where you get to Kathleen's proposal and this PMAX RA term. And so all this is saying is you're going to give the CPUC the data so they could accurately calculate the shown RA. And so whatever that term is, that's also what the must offer should be based on, because that's what's being used to calculate the UCAP in the first place.
Yeah, so today's process, where does the deliverability come in place? The PUC/the LRAs, they do their QC calculation based on PMAX. The QC value is not impacted by deliverability today. They give us the QC value, then we apply deliverability cuts to the QC value, and that establishes the NQC. So I think with UCAP, we can follow these steps. So UCAP is now assessing the what's the impact of forced outages to PMAX. That gives us a QC.
No.
We cut it by deliverability.
So what I'm saying is that doesn't work anymore. And maybe I'll just pause there and say, let's talk about this offline and let me walk you through the math, because you will end up, if you do it that way, as having a portion of energy only capacity count as RA. Because I think you're still thinking of the shown RA as what's needed for reliability. But fundamentally, a move to UCAP means that the full must offer obligation is needed for reliability.
Okay.
And that's the switch. So you have to check that full must offer obligation is actually deliverable, because that's what the CPUC is counting on.
Oh, I see your point.
Yeah.
Okay, so what we're doing is we're keeping the shown RA, which counts towards the LSC's obligations, deliverable. We're proposing for the MOO to be potentially partially tapping into the energy only or non-deliverable portion. Yes, we are doing that. And I think we're doing that intentionally because the deliverability study is making assumptions in advance based on peak conditions. But hour by hour, what the resource can do, it can exceed the deliverable portion, and maybe in a given hour. And what we're saying is, we want to get that bid into the market and let the market decide what's feasible to dispatch. We are trying to avoid, since we're, I mean, obviously it's debatable, but since we're now for the first time probably trying to set the MOO higher than the shown RA, how high can we go? Well, we said, why cap the MOO at the deliverable amount? Let's actually go beyond that.
I hear what you're doing, but I don't think that's the right way to do it. And that's not how any other ISO does it. Okay. So I think that needs to be reconsidered. Okay. I have like 3 minutes. So I'm just going to highlight each slide real quick.
One point.
3 minutes, Rahul. Okay.
I think we need a commitment to have this discussion, more discussion. Like that's the point.
Yeah.
And the key aspect from our perspective is RA is a Jenga. If you move one piece and assume everything else stays, it does not. And like there are people who are signing contracts, really do not understand what's coming down the pipe. And they're signing up for something that's going to change on them. So that's my plug.
Yeah, thank you, Rahul. Thank you. Totally agree. Okay, I'm just going to whip through these really quickly. I got this data from Middle River Power. All this is showing is that forced outages are random. They are random. They have always been random. They probably always will be random. There are some ways to incent resources to come back from forced outages as quickly as possible, right? By having RAIM penalties and certain, but no one ever claimed RAIM was going to be able to significantly reduce forced outages because you can't. We also, in the context of where we are right now, is that we have an aging gas fleet, right? We have not built new gas in a long time, and we're not going to build new gas. So really, in the context of RAIM and incentives and things like the SNU, we should acknowledge that we need to take care of our gas fleet. And yes, provide appropriate incentives for maintenance, but also give opportunities, especially within the outage structure, to let resources take that maintenance. And yes, it may be a little bit harder and operators may have to do additional studies, but when you have a fleet like ours, where you have an aging gas fleet, you have to do that. I also want to note that we are not like the East Coast. We don't have massive fuel insufficiency outages, that we don't need mechanisms like the East Coast. We need RAIM mechanisms for our fleet. So UCAP itself does not justify RAIM design. I'm very sad I don't have time to go through this slide in detail, but at a very high level, I'll just remind everyone that the RAIM design has a lower bound on it at 94.5%. And the reason why we did that is because we acknowledged that the planning reserve margin accounted for some amount of forced outages. So it's expected that resources would take forced outages, and we were not going to penalize all resources up to 100%. Now, when we translate that to UCAP, in my mind, and I will say this is my mind, this is not WPTF, this is food for thought for everyone. In my mind, what UCAP does is kind of the same thing. It is acknowledging that there will be some unavailability within that shown number. And so if the CAISO assesses RAIM on the UCAP value, that's kind of the same thing as assessing RAIM on the buffer. It's the same concept. One is a fleet-wide average for forced outages, and the other one is a resource-specific acknowledgement that, yes, my UCAP includes an acknowledgement that it will be on forced outages up to that amount. That's its expected value. And so if you wanted to keep RAIM just for a little bit longer, what I think you could do is just say, okay, UCAP megawatts, you don't have a buffer anymore. We're just going to assess you at 100% on the RAIM today because, you know, you have that buffer now between your must offer and your shown amount. That's kind of equal to this buffer. So now shown RA is just assessed at 100%. And if you wanted to, without going through this crazy RAIM redesign, you could do that. Okay. This is a note about how I think you should be thinking about it, but you could go through all of this. I will note that if you go through the slide in detail, I took a lot of this from Calpine's comments. I think they have incredibly rational comments, and I highly encourage you to augment your proposal in alignment of what they say. I will also note that it really is hard for me to understand why an RSC failure would be attributable in any proportion to a generator without finding first whether that they're the one causing it. There's a lot of reasons for an RSC failure, and it's an energy failure because energy counts toward the RSC. So unless you actually look at who's causing the failure, it seems very unjust and unreasonable just to say, let's allocate it arbitrarily to generators. And then finally, and this is the last slide I'll do because I know I'm out of time. Okay, a 5-hour tier 2 event just can be $1 million. That's equivalent to a $10 per kilowatt month penalty. And if you propose something like that, that will immediately be priced into RA contracts. That's a huge tail risk, and you're going to spike the RA price really for no reason. You don't want to include tail risks in the RA price. That's incredibly inefficient and costly to ratepayers. And compared to the current RAME price, which again has a buffer to it, is enough, I think, to crack open every single existing RA contract, which is also very costly. So we really want to avoid things like this. I think the penalty cap has some merit. I think there are some trade-offs there, though. Yes, it's a transactable amount, but now you don't have incentives to come back from forced outages as fast as possible if you've already hit that cap. I think it's much better just to have a rational, fixed, capacity-based penalty to begin with. Thank you very much, and I'm sorry I went over.
I appreciate that. Yeah, maybe one piece of feedback too. Obviously, I think part of our design was like intentionally not trying to tie in like our tier 2 to say that the reason why we're in tier 2 was because of, let's just say, even aggregate generator actions. There's obviously a correlation of you facing a penalty during that tier 2 event. We recognize that, particularly if we're going to go down the avenue of saying like, here's your pro rata share of the EDAM RSC failure charges, that'd be different. It'd be a different amount, potentially much higher during some of these stress conditions. And so we were cognizant of it. It was more of a correlating this as a basically a high impact event where we want to have a high incentive for being available during that time period. But we're walking that line of not necessarily wanting to attribute it to saying this was the event was due to your or the aggregate unavailability. So one clarification, but yeah, thanks, Carrie. Let's see.
We're kind of at time, but we can have a quick moment if you want to add something.
Quick, Carrie, thank you for that presentation. So instead of the 2,000, are you saying like we collect contract prices and use that for?
Oh God, no! I'm saying you use a fixed capacity value that is relevant to the RA market or any sort of capacity like a RCU. Again, I encourage you to read Calpine's comments. I thought they articulated it well.
Oh yeah, it looks like we have one final hand from Perry online. Perry, if you could make it a quick question before we wrap up here.
Sure. Perry Servideo, California Energy Storage Alliance. I just wanted to thank Carrie for putting together the slides. That's really good coverage on all of what I would still consider the open issues. And I especially liked the slide showing that we really need to get crisp on the definitions of these things. And I did need to make the point because full DAC and QC came up. This is maybe more for Kevin before you leave the room there. I wanted to say, yeah, I see you. I just wanted to say that that definition thing, if you look at the CPUC's decision, they based their QC calculation on the way that maximum continuous energy is defined today. And I think the main point that it is that if CAISO changes the meaning of that definition, the CPC decision would no longer meet the intent that they were after. So I think it just becomes a definitional fix there. I don't want to try to overblow that. And then one last thing, just on the very last point on that penalty price, and I think we've included this in our comments, that it would be really smart to move away from having day-ahead energy prices and values like $2,000 a megawatt hour setting the penalty prices here. Again, this is for lack. You could say it would be caused, however you define it, you would say it would be caused by lack of capacity. The penalty should be tied to the replacement cost of capacity. Being on outage does not necessarily mean that the LMP goes up, especially if it's an old resource that would not have been dispatched out of merit anyway. So that's, I'll just leave it at that. I have other reasons, but we should be looking towards replacement cost of capacity as setting penalty prices. Thank you.
Thanks, Perry. Thanks, Carrie. I really appreciate your presentation. We certainly will go through the substance of the slides where we've spoken with Calpine, we've read their proposals, so we also are familiar with some of the details. Maybe I'll just offer up more broadly for the next set of comments. Obviously, we're trying to refine and hone this presentation to be effective and to meet the various, to balance some of our objectives and some of the commercial needs of participants. To whoever degree that you all can provide us super direct recommendations of, here's how you'd recommend that we alter our proposal. Even if you don't fully support the proposal, even with that caveat, you could say, hey, well, we don't think this is we don't like this design as a whole, but here's something in particular where if you're going to go forward, this is a method that you all would recommend. And to whoever agrees, particularly if there is consensus that the group could reach, or like minds could say, hey, like we all as a group think that this is one in particular where if you made this change, it at least it would better balance the various objectives. I think that could be really helpful for us iterating going forward. But I would say too, yeah, really appreciate the engagement today. That was a really good discussion. Rahul, I saw you raised your
Just have one comment.
Sure.
There are certain things that have just happened at CPUC that requires us to think through, how to think about those changes. We might not know what a good way to solve this is, but we know there is an issue that needs to be solved. That's how you would want us to include in the comment?
I think those are fair. We're obviously not going to limit what people say in their comments. I do think that like a lot of the information that Carrie provided was, the discussion that you led was very valuable. It is something, a lot of the topics are ones that we are considering as well. How we'll engage on that going forward, I think is something that we'll need to discuss internally. So I don't necessarily have a direct answer, but I do feel like it was really a valuable discussion to have. And if I certainly we'll create a comment template. I think we'll obviously allow, feedback on WPTS presentation as well within that template. I think that might be sort of a good avenue to describe both maybe the substance and the process in terms of how to address it. But I'll need to sort of recircle back with the team and figure out sort of
just one feedback is, we might have some questions that are, okay, we don't like the proposal. We might have comments there, but there are certain things which we would like this to be resolved. And if you could bucket them into two different things, right? Like when you get feedback and say, okay, this is a proposal we cannot entertain, I can understand that. But there are certain issues if we don't address, it's left to interpretation. So that's a bucket that would like to see.
Yeah, absolutely. There too. Like clarifications are always like, that's the bare minimum. If we can clarify and make it clear about what the proposal is, absolutely. If there are specific changes you all would like to have and say, like, hey, that's maybe one step above it, in terms of what the changes are. But yeah, appreciate that feedback, Rahul. Yeah, but no, thank you again. Really appreciate the great engagement today, and Christine, I'll turn it back to you.
Thanks, Martha, and thanks everyone for your participation today. For stakeholder comments on today's meeting, they're requested by August 5th via the comment tool on our RAMPD webpage, and all meeting materials are posted there, and we'll also be posting the meeting recording there soon. If you have any additional questions or any feedback, anything that you didn't get to ask today, feel free to email us at isostakeholderaffairs@kaiso.com or include the feedback in your comments. I'll be really quick here and go through, here are some stakeholder meetings and comment submission deadlines occurring this week at the ISO. Here's some DAME and EDAM resources. And here are market simulation details and business practice manual updates. For instance, into the ISO grid and market operations, here's our Energy Matters blog. We also have a podcast frequency band. Here's the launch of a new publication series. And here's some details on registering for our 2026 symposium. So with that, we'd like to thank you so much for joining today's meeting. We thank you and we hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.